Chapter 572. Because of the bank robbery, Song Yu's parents were quite frightened, and Song Yu, who was almost separated from her parents, was so scared that she welcomed her parents home and spent the night with them. From the looks of it, the small misunderstandings between the family of three should also be resolved because of this accident. It was precisely because of this that the next morning, Song Yu didn't come to Sakura apartment, and the responsibility of breakfast fell to Asahi Sakura Kanji. "Pomi-ai, can you wake Mr. Su up?" The maid girl said to the dog girl, who was lying on the sofa, smelling the fragrance and wagging her tail. Yes, the dog girl immediately jumped off the sofa and ran happily up the stairs, almost bumping into Qin Xingyan, who was coming to the living room. "Asahi, thank you for your hard work." After coming to the dining table near the kitchen in the living room, Qin Xingyan sat at the table and greeted the maid girl who was busy in the kitchen. "Ah, Xingyan-chan." Asahi put down the things in her hand and wiped her hands on her apron. "Do you want to eat salad and toast or miso fish with rice?" It seemed that today's breakfast was not the same as the usual hodgepodge of ancient and modern Chinese food. It was Western and Japanese food. "Just give me a cup of coffee." After becoming a celestial, Qin Xingyan's sense of taste seemed to have undergone subtle changes, and she didn't feel much about most of the food in the human world. Now, she might even be able to fight canned herring or the stargazy pie. It was just that years of hard work made the girl's taste lean towards light food, and now she even began to have a tendency to abstain from eating. "Is coffee enough?" Well, add a spoon of sugar." "Okay." Perhaps everyone had a similar feeling. Although two people who knew each other could talk normally when a group of friends was around, when the two were alone, they would find that they didn't know what to say. Now Qin Xingyan and Asahi Sakura Kanji were in a similar awkward situation. This made one of them feel like she was sitting on pins and needles, while the other didn't even know where to put her hands. This awkward atmosphere lasted for a long time before it was broken by a new voice. Good morning, everyone." Qinzhao Shinshan, who had a bunch of stupid hair on her head, walked slowly from the corridor and sat down on her seat as if she was sleepwalking. She was a little hypoglycemic, and it seemed that she hadn't fully woken up yet. "Lord Chihaya?" "Wah! Asahi, what's wrong?" Chihaya Fukuyama, who was shocked and finally sobered up a little, looked at Asahi Sakura Kanji, whose eyes were brimming with tears, like a puppy that had finally found its owner. He was confused. "No, nothing. Please enjoy your meal, Lord Chihaya." After placing the breakfast in thousand morning noodles deep in the mountains, Sakura Kobayashi, who had finally sorted out her emotions, returned to the kitchen and began to work with vigor again. "Oh, it's a Japanese breakfast." Qinzhao Shunshan glanced at the breakfast style that she had rarely seen since she came to the Celestial Empire. She could not help but pick up her chopsticks expectantly. She picked up a piece of stewed, soft, and flavorful fish and tasted it. "It's delicious." "I'm glad you like it." Asahi Sakura Kanji, who was in the kitchen, heard Chihaya Fukuyama's compliment and replied with a smile. "What's wrong?" Qin Xingyan, who was drinking coffee, noticed that Chihaya Fukuyama was looking at him with a strange expression, so he asked, "Yesterday, Ms. Song Yu." "No, nothing." Chihaya Fukuyama was halfway through his sentence when he felt that it was inappropriate to talk behind someone's back, so he gave up. Qin Xingyan wasn't the type of person who was extremely curious and didn't want to get to the bottom of things, so he didn't ask. After a while, Qin Xingyan put down the teacup in his hand. "Asahi, did you just ask the Pomeranian to wake Senpai up?" Yes. "Then why haven't they come down yet?" I don't know." Asahi replied with a bitter smile. Qin Xingyan stood up and sighed. "Forget it, I'll go over." In Su Xinxing's room. "Senpai, it's time to wake up." Qin Xingyan called out softly, but there was no reaction from the bed at all. The girl opened the curtains, but unlike usual, there was no sunlight shining in. Instead, there was the patter of rain outside the window. "Xiao Yu." She sighed and returned to the bed. She shook the bulging blanket and said, "Senpai, it's time to get up and eat breakfast." But there was still no reaction from the thing. In the end, the girl could only summon her two flying swords. They had been refined by Qin Xingyan again. At this moment, they were as clear as crystal. Only the crested ibis and emerald green light could be seen flowing inside. Of course, the reason she summoned the flying swords was not to cut the bulging blanket, but simply to make some noise. The two flying swords clashed and made a rather ear-piercing noise. Part of the things inside the blanket rolled to the ground. Ah, it hurts. Then the dog girl with messy hair got up from the ground. She looked dizzy and disoriented. What was that sound? It scared the hell out of me. Pomeranian, didn't Asahi ask you to wake Senpai up? Why are you sleeping here as well? Qin Xingyan patted the dog girl's head and asked, I don't know. I just threw myself onto Xiao Yu's blanket to wake him up. Then I smelled something nice and realized I was being hugged like a blanket. The dog girl was also confused. Is that so? That's so enviable. Angry. Anyway, hurry up and wake up, Senpai. Qin Xingyan turned around and lifted the blanket. He wanted to wake Su Xinqing up, but he found Su Xinqing lying on his back in his pajamas, with Emily hanging on his body. The girl's gorgeous golden hair covered half of the bed. Oh, Xingyan. It was only then that Su Xinqing yawned and opened his eyes slightly. Emily just rubbed against Su Xinqing as if trying to get deeper into his arms. Sleep again. 5 Yuan speak. Senpai, you're finally awake. Qin Xingyan sighed in relief. Asahi has already prepared breakfast. I see. Su Xinqing wanted to get up, but he found that Jasmine was sleeping on his chest. This made him reveal a smile that was mixed with helplessness and distress. You go eat first. I'll be there soon. Okay. Qin Xingyan looked at Emily's koala-like appearance and couldn't help but smile helplessly. She dragged the dog girl by the collar with one hand and walked towards the door. Then, as if she remembered something, she turned around and smiled brightly at Su Xinqing. Oh, right. Good morning, Senpai. Today seems to be a beautiful day. Chapter 573. When Su Xinqing came downstairs, he found another person sitting on the sofa in the living room. Oh, sorry. I won't be polite with your breakfast. Xiao. Zhengyi was clumsily eating a piece of toast with salad and ham with his unbandaged left hand. When he saw Su Xinqing coming from the hallway, he didn't forget to wave the sandwich with teeth marks in his hand. He then took a big bite with a proud expression. I've already remade it for you. Please wait a moment. Asahi Sakura Kanji bowed slightly to Su Xinqing. I'm fine with it, but you better hurry up. Su Xinqing sighed. He didn't want to argue with Xiao Zhengyi, because Emily is already grinding her teeth. Asahi Sakura Kanji laughed dryly and ran back to the kitchen. Let me confirm. After Xiao Zhengyi swallowed the food in his mouth, he cautiously looked at the little girl on Su Xinqing's back. She seemed to be emitting some kind of dark aura. That girl won't eat people, right? What a coincidence. I still don't know if humans are part of Emily's diet. Why don't we try it today? Su Xinqing glanced at Xiao Zhengyi. Please don't. The latter immediately backed down. I thought you would be a little more stubborn. As a public servant, can't you be a little more stubborn? Can stubbornness make my bones last a second under that girl's teeth? No. Then it's fine. Xiao Zhengyi shrugged. He looked like he knew it. He wasn't really worried that Emily would eat people. After all, according to Su Xinqing's moral cleanliness, eating people was already crossing his bottom line. As long as Emily was by Su Xinqing's side, he didn't have to worry about this strange girl attacking people. The reason he cooperated with Su Xinqing was more to ease the atmosphere before they talked about business. This was a little tacit understanding between the two of them. Good boy, Emily. I have some biscuits here. Do you want some? Yes, say it. Perhaps sensing this, Qin Xingyan used a few sandwich biscuits to make Emily jump down from Su Xinqing's back. Emily ran to the table and ate the biscuits while waiting for breakfast. So, why are you here so early today? Since it was the weekend, Chiketsu seemed to have slept in for the first time in a long time. Or maybe she was tripped by Yu Zhengjing, who walked into the wrong room after waking up in the middle of the night. Since she didn't seem to have woken up, Su Xinqing didn't have to worry that she would overhear something she shouldn't hear. Therefore, he just found a comfortable position and sat on the sofa opposite Xiao Jingyi, waiting for her to continue. The group of people you caught yesterday, I did a little investigation with the bureau chief. When it came to business, Xiao Zhengyi's expression became serious. Those guys' bodies have some kind of mutation, right? Su Xinqing thought back to yesterday's situation and asked casually. Well, although from the biological mechanism of their muscles, they are still at the level of an ordinary person, when we actually carry out experiments, we can find that those guys' muscle fibers are at least 20 times tougher than ordinary people's, and their strength is far beyond the scope of what ordinary people can achieve. To be honest, they have a better future if they go into weightlifting than robbing banks, because a lot of people, after suddenly gaining strength, will show a blind and inflated mentality. It's normal for them to do unwise things, Su Xinqing said matter-of-factly. What's wrong? When Xiao Zhengyi looked at Su Xinqing as if he was meeting him for the first time, he frowned and asked, No, how should I put it? I'm not used to hearing you say such serious things. So, I'm that unreliable in your mind? Yeah, let's continue to talk about business. Xiao Jingyi turned his face to avoid Su Xinqing's piercing and really painful eyes and said, after the second big sister of Xinsu used the truth-telling bomb. Wait a second. Su Xinqing reached out and stopped him. I feel like the word truth-telling and bomb don't match. Is that so? Generally speaking, it should be truth-telling physics. I don't think yours is any better. Xiao Jingyi rubbed his temples like he had a headache. He then continued, In short, after using the torture bomb, we received some strange information. Su Xinqing asked, Did the name of the bomb change? Tossing his ridicule aside, Xiao Jingyi continued with a straight face. They obtained their power from the dream. To be specific, they heard a voice in the dream, and that voice would ask them to prepare some things as sacrifices. If the sacrifice was successful, they would be able to obtain power. What's this? A devil's contract? Su Xinqing asked with some surprise. If it's really the legendary devil's contract in Europe, it's fine. After all, it can be solved according to the book. But the problem is that the things that the voice asked for are very strange. Xiao Jingyi's expression was a bit subtle. The first time was a large amount of black bread or similar edible things. The second time was a large amount of fresh water and charcoal. The third time was women's clothing. Well, we also solved the Golden City Luxury Mansion women's underwear theft case. This devil's taste is a bit strange, I don't know, but according to the identification of the experts invited by the Bureau, the bodies of those guys should have been given some kind of strengthening spell, and it's not a very advanced spell. In fact, it feels a bit crude. Xiao Jingyi sighed. Rather than a deal with the devil, I always feel that those guys were played by some magic apprentices of the classical school. Then, do you have any clues? A little. Xiao Jingyi took out a brass pocket watch and put it in front of Su Xinqing. Those guys were originally a group of construction workers. The only thing they had in common was that they were all present when they picked up this thing at the construction site. The workers who weren't present didn't have any strange dreams. This thing, Su Xinqing frowned. Why do I feel that it's a bit familiar? Of course you feel that it's familiar. That thing was yours in the first place. Now that you mention it, after hearing Xiao Jingyi's words, Su Xinqing suddenly remembered that when he had just returned to this world, it seemed that he had pawned an item that he carried with him because he was short of money, and at that time, because it was obviously worthless, but it was sold for a very high price, he had been happy for a long time. Just as Su Xinqing was about to say something, his ghost spirit had already floated over with a plate of fried rice. Oh, my breakfast is already ready. Su Xinqing, who had always believed that eating was the most important thing in the world, took a bite of the fried rice, and then his vision suddenly turned black. He could only vaguely hear someone not far away shouting something like, Wait, Mr. Ghost, when did you make the instant seafood fried rice? In the last moment before he lost consciousness, old Su silently cursed in his heart. Damn, how is this day beautiful? Chapter 574. Oh, mighty Reedman, Using the ancient god's tooth that has been passed down from generation to generation as a medium, I beg your great spirit to give me a look of pity. Ugh. In the darkness, Su Xinxing felt that he seemed to hear someone whispering in his ear. Although he did not answer, the question was still transmitted to the other party through some unknown link. However, the other party seemed to have mistaken the reason for his doubts. As the current successor of the Reedman family and the only remaining descendant of the Reedman bloodline, I ask you to help me revive my family. Perhaps it was because of the double blow of the ghost spirits cooking and the seafood, Su Xinxing felt that his head was muddled. Even his thoughts were a little chaotic for a while, and he could not think. Now, you can make your request. No matter what the price is, I am willing to bear it. The other party's sincere intentions were also transmitted to Su Xinxing through the unknown link. Although he was not quite sure what was going on, because his mouth had eaten something that was far beyond dark cuisine, what Su Xinxing wanted now was very simple. In short, give me a glass of water first. Although the other party's doubts were also transmitted, it seemed that the other party had satisfied Su Xinxing's request for the time being. After a while, the cool and pure water flowed into Su Xinxing's mouth, washing away most of the strange taste that still remained on his taste buds. Cough, cough, I'm alive! Thus, Su Xinxing's consciousness was completely awakened. He opened his eyes and found that he seemed to be at the scene of some evil cult performing an evil sacrificial ritual. This was the interior of a man-made cave. With the dim light, he could vaguely see a huge magic circle drawn with something that was probably blood on the ground. There was also a brazier in the corner of the room. Accompanied by the dancing flames, the wonderful smell of burning spices and bursts of white smoke were rising, and he was half lying in the center of the magic circle, as if he was being used as a sacrifice to the evil god. Not far in front of him, a person dressed like a member of the FFF group, wearing a pointy hood, was kneeling in front of the magic circle, looking at Su Xinxing with surprise, joy, and fear. In front of the kneeling person, there was a cup made of wood. "Where is this? Who are you?" Su Xinxing scratched his head and asked the other party in confusion. The other party was a little scared, and asked Su Xinxing cautiously, "Are you the legendary evil god, Auravaya?" "What?" Su Xinxing was dumbfounded. What the hell is going on? Although old Su had left his footprints in many worlds, had many messy identities, and had even played the role of a demon king who destroyed the world, he had never been an evil god, and, for some unknown reason, he felt a subtle weakness in his body. Wait a minute. This weakness, it seems like I've had a similar situation before. That's right, his current physical condition felt similar to when he met the dog girl. He thought for a moment, and then realized that he was probably not being used as a sacrifice for some evil ritual, but an existence that the other party summoned through an evil ritual. However, Su Xinxing's composition was very complicated, and his form of existence was even more difficult for ordinary creatures to understand. Therefore, even if Su Xinxing was summoned through a certain method, he would only get the feedback of the search target does not exist. But there was one exception. "What did you use as a medium to summon me?" At the thought of this, Su Xinxing narrowed his eyes and asked the hooded person in front of him. "It's an ancient god's tooth that was taken from the skull of Auravaya, the greatest treasure passed down from generation to generation in the Reedman family." The other party replied respectfully, "It's said that it's the skull of the human you relied on the last time you appeared in this world, and it's filled with incomparably dense, undead magic. It's also because of this that our family embarked on the path of necromancers." Su Xinxing then realized that the hooded person's voice belonged to the relatively shrill type. Coupled with the other party's short stature, it was probably either a woman or a child before her voice changed. Then, he found the ancient god's tooth that the other party mentioned in the magic circle. As soon as he held it in his hand, Su Xinxing had a feeling. That's right, this thing was indeed his tooth. It seemed that the so-called skull of Auravaya should be the head of the corpse he lost. Since Su Xinxing's corpse was used as a medium to summon, it wasn't surprising that a small part of him could be summoned. Tell me the details. Things have changed with the passage of time, and I've forgotten everything about your world. No matter what, Su Xinxing decided to retrieve his skull as soon as possible. In order to prevent a setback, it was necessary to know a little about this world. Although the other party seemed to think that the evil god she summoned was a little too easy to talk to, she didn't think much about it and introduced some of the general situation of this world to Su Xinxing. Simply put, this should be a world of swords and magic, and compared to Japanese RPGs, it was closer to the feeling of a Western fantasy. It was just that this world should be a low-magic world. Although magic existed, there were very few people who could use it. Many people would never see it in their lifetime, and the power of magic was very limited. From the other party's description, even the so-called great magic could cause damage equivalent to intercontinental missiles at most. The Riedman family was originally a small noble family in the Horngarat Empire. They owned a small piece of land and could be considered a small landlord. It was just that this family actually had the inheritance of the evil god Auravaya and had been secretly studying necromancy. But after all, this was only a low-magic world. Rather than necromancy, the things this family studied were closer to modern medical anatomy, and most of the dissections were the bodies of sinners. Because of this, the patriarch of the Riedman family was dedicated to the development of medicine on the surface and treated the people fairly well. It could be said that they were quite kind nobles. But even so, when a soldier of the Riedman family informed the church the patriarch of the family was hanged in his mansion, and the originally prosperous Riedman family was also rebelled by the people. The men were brutally murdered, and the women were burned to death. Only the person in front of Su Xinxing escaped with a tooth in the skull, hid in this cave, and used the method recorded in the family's ancient books to summon the legendary evil god. Chapter 575. So, what are you planning to do by summoning me? After figuring out the current situation, Su Xinxing asked the culprit in front of him who made him run to this world. Although the culprit spoke as if his family was innocent, old Su was not the kind of person who would casually believe the words of others. After all, no one would cry and ask for help and say how heinous they were and how many heinous things they had done to attract such evil consequences. Otherwise, not only would they not be helped, but they would also be spat on and told that they deserved it. Perhaps this so-called Riedman family was just like 731 who did human experiments and angered the heavens and people, which was why they were wiped out. After all, according to the culprit's description, in the territory of the nobles, most of the primary industry was farming, and the poor people who were in charge of farming were relatively unarmed. If they wanted to start a revolution, they would have to pay a lot of sacrifices. So, in theory, unless it caused public anger or they could not live on, the peasants should not rebel and overthrow the nobles. I hope you can help me revive the Riedman family. The culprit said in a sincere tone. What is the definition of revival? Killing all those who rebelled, taking back the land, and handing it over to you to manage? Su Xinxing asked. In his opinion, since the culprit summoned him, the evil god in their impression, to help, then there was an 80% chance that this was the purpose. No, it's not like that. But out of his expectation, the man shook his head. When my father sent me out of the castle, he hoped that I would not avenge the Riedman family. He believed that endless vengeance would not be able to push forward the development of the era and would only make the world even more chaotic. Oh, you really don't want to avenge your dead family? Let me say for the time being, I am very powerful. No matter how conservative the estimation is, no human in this era is a match for me. Not to mention a ragtag army made up of peasants. Even the regular imperial army or the adepts that you mentioned before, who can summon the wind and summon the rain, are no match for me. Su Xinxing used a seductive tone to persuade the other party. When the time comes, let alone reviving your family, it's not impossible for you to own a country or even rule the entire world. He was not boasting. even if his current strength had plummeted because of the incomplete summoning like in the Beastman world. But for a low magic world that had not even broken out of the planet, he was still equivalent to a human disaster. To be honest, what you said is very tempting. But neither my father nor I have much interest in those things. The culprit's voice had a hint of a bitter smile. What I want you to do is simply to get me out of the pursuit and help me to rebuild the Reedman family. You're being unreasonable. Old Sue pretended to be angry. If that's the case, why did you summon us? And because Su Xinxing did not know whether to laugh or cry. So, the culprit did not specifically want to summon him, but he was the only one that could be summoned. Anyway, it was great that the culprit was not a madman full of vengeance. Otherwise, Su Xinxing might have to slowly fumble around in this unfamiliar world. You're not taking off that mask of yours? Old Sue, who had relaxed a little, asked casually. I forgot. The culprit knocked on his head. I was wondering why I felt that something was not right. Then he forcefully took off the conical hood on his head, revealing his true face underneath. It was a rather beautiful but neutral face, but it seemed that he had not had a good rest for a long time and was a little haggard. In addition, the only thing that caught Su Xinxing's attention was the culprit's emerald green hair. That is your hair color passed down from generation to generation? Finally, he could not help but ask, well, people with the bloodline of the Reedman family all have green hair. It is said that it symbolizes the broad mind and heart of the ancestors. The culprit nodded and then showed a distressed look. But because the hair color is too eye-catching, it is so difficult to avoid the search. Damn it, I don't know where to start complaining. Su Xinxing cursed in his heart. After a while, Su Xinxing continued, also, I have a question. Please ask. Because the legendary evil god showed a serious expression, the culprit looked a little uneasy. Are you a man or a woman? The culprit was stunned for a long time, and finally a little blush appeared on his face, and he replied in a somewhat embarrassed tone, I am a girl. Well, if it was Zheng Tai, according to the nature of the will of a certain universe, the culprit would have been dug and buried before he came to this world. In short, if there is nothing else, get ready and we will set off. After throwing the thought of isn't that better into the trash can, old Sue could only say so. Set off? Where are we going? The culprit widened his eyes and asked strangely. Of course, to rebuild that whatever family of yours. Su Xinxing answered casually. However, if he were to describe it in a more game-like way, rebuilding the Reedman family was only a side mission. The reason why Su Xinxing still stayed in this world was only for one purpose, and that was to recover his skull. It's the Reedman family. Can I really believe you? The culprit hesitated for a moment, and then asked, Do I not look trustworthy? Su Xinxing asked back. No, it's just that rebuilding a noble family requires a lot of money, but I think you look very poor. He was attacked in a way that was unexpected. It's okay. If you want to get money in this world, there are many ways. But soon, old Sue regained his confidence. Please be sure not to do anything that violates the Constitution. The culprit seemed to be very uneasy. Then isn't there only one way to rob the dragon's lair? Why? Are all your ways of making money recorded in the Constitution? Actually, some should be recorded in the criminal law. Is this the main point of the problem? By the way, there is one more thing. Su Xinxing jumped down from the magic circle and then patted his head as if he remembered something. What's your name again? E? At this moment, Louise Reedman felt that she had summoned a fake evil god. Chapter 576. It was obvious where Louise Reedman was hiding. It was a cave, and compared to what Su Xinxing had thought, this cave was much deeper. It would take about 5 to 6 minutes to walk out from the inside, and the narrowest part even required one to lean sideways to get through. As long as there were no transcendents on the other side, and they did not know how to use smoke, it was a relatively easy terrain to defend and hard to attack. There seemed to be vents inside the cave, Even if charcoal was lit as a source of light and heat, there was no need to worry about carbon monoxide poisoning or hypoxia shock. Su Xinxing walked around the inside of the cave and saw the dried meat of unknown animals hanging on the wall and the toast stacked in a wooden bucket. He also saw the underwear that was obviously not from the same era as the girl's clothes. The latter was immediately put away by Louise with a red face. The bread, water, clothes, and fuel were all exchanged with the demons in the Forbidden Realm, using the ancient god's tooth as a medium. Although those demons seemed to be very easy to talk to and only took some of my magic power, Louise explained to Su Xinxing. Su Xinxing nodded noncommittally. It seemed that the reason for the change in the Farmers' Union was indeed because they had made a deal with the girl who did not know the truth. But if that was the case, where did the weapons in their hands come from? The technology tree of this world did not seem to be the type that could produce AK-47s. In addition to these relatively normal things, there was also a skeleton in the cave. The skeleton was very short, probably only reaching Su Xinxing's chest. Rather than saying that it was clothes, it was more like rags. 2 daggers hung on both sides of its pelvis. The daggers were full of gaps and rust and seemed to be quite old. Seeing that Su Xinxing was looking at the skeleton, Louise explained with a slightly proud tone, "She's called Lola. She's the first undead that our family has successfully summoned." It wasn't that Su Xinxing hadn't seen skeletons before. In fact, he had even seen undead calamities that covered the sky and earth. However, the skeletons in front of him were clearly different from the cannon fodder of the necromancers that he had seen in the past. Unlike those low-level skeletons that were as rigid as marionettes, every movement was very natural. When Su Xinxing first saw it, it even opened its mouth, leaving only its jaws and teeth, and made a gesture that resembled a smile. After all, in the fantasy world that Su Xinxing had transmigrated to, only high-level undead creatures like the Skeleton Lord and above could move so naturally. Apart from the lack of internal organs, muscles, and skin, there wasn't much of a difference between a skeleton and a living person. Wait, she? Yes, Laura is a girl. Louise nodded. It's said to be the skeleton of one of the heroes who once saved the country, but it's been too long, so there's no way to verify it. Because of this, my grandfather seemed to think that the corpses of people with heroic souls like heroes were more likely to react to necromancy. What was this? A heroic soul? Su Xinxing couldn't help but frown. But there are traces of heroes whose graves are more heavily guarded. If it's not a royal garden, it's a mass grave of the army. It's difficult to get suitable materials. After several fruitless attempts, my grandfather gave up the practice of stealing heroes' corpses and began to return to normal research. The girl continued. Fortunately, you gave up. It's very dangerous. Su Xinxing muttered to himself. Well, I don't think that's right. For heroes, it's better to let them rest in peace. The girl nodded hurriedly. No, if you continue to rob tombs, the name of this volume may become Grave Robbers Chronicles. It's very dangerous in terms of copyright. Actually, I have another skeleton called Cooper. Well, Cooper should be back soon. The girl glanced at the light spots on the wall from the vent, confirmed the time, and nodded. Sure enough, it didn't take long for a relatively tall figure to enter the cave from the direction of the entrance. It was a male skeleton. Even without skin and flesh, it was still much taller than Su Xinxing. It was estimated that the other party was 9 meters or even 2 meters tall when he was alive. Unlike Rala, who was quietly sitting in the corner with a skeleton specimen, Cooper was holding a cookery knife stained with blood in his right hand and a small animal similar to a rabbit in his left hand. At this time, the unfortunate prey was constantly dripping blood. Coupled with Cooper's appearance, it gave off a thriller-like atmosphere just by standing there. Well done, Cooper. Louise seemed to be very happy. Lord, evil god, do you want to eat roasted rabbit? Or, as long as it's flesh and blood, it doesn't matter if it's raw or cooked. Although it doesn't matter if it's raw or cooked, in terms of personal preference, it's better to have it cooked. Su Xinxing replied casually, then glanced at Cooper. "Is that also your ancestral skeleton?" "No, Cooper, it's a skeleton that I summoned myself." The girl hesitated, then continued, "The church seems to have issued a bounty for me, and the bounty is not low. Cooper is a bounty hunter. He found my trail and wanted to capture me to collect the bounty, but he was assassinated by Rala. I tried to use his body as a material to use necromancy, and I didn't expect it to succeed." "Oh, I see. Lord Evil God's reaction is so cold." The girl seemed to be a little angry. Perhaps she thought that Su Xinxing would express some opinions, but found that he was not even interested in this relationship. "Because human matters are good to me." Su Xinxing pretended to be serious. After all, Louise was just a stranger to him, and with her desire to rebuild her family, she probably would not leave this world. In that case, there was no need for him to be too familiar with her. It was better to leave after finishing what he wanted to do and helping her fulfill her wish. It should be known that humans basically had a sentimental side. Regardless of whether it was a person or an object, once they understood it too deeply, they would naturally have feelings. Rather than having feelings and reluctance to part, it would be better to not get familiar with it from the start. Are all the so-called Lord Gods so arrogant? The girl muttered softly. Su Xinxing's attention was indeed no longer on Louise. He turned his head to look at the dark entrance, raising his eyebrows slightly. "What's wrong?" Noticing that Su Xinxing's expression was strange, the girl could not help but ask. "You'd better be prepared." Su Xinxing narrowed his eyes and stared at the darkness. "Your skeleton is being followed." Chapter 577. Stalking. As soon as Louise finished speaking, a cold arrow shot out from the dark corner of the cave with a flash of cold light. It hit Cooper's body and got stuck at the junction between his ribs and spine. The two skeletons reacted immediately. Lola pulled out her dagger and began to sneak towards the place where the arrow came from. The whole process was silent, just like a master of stealth. Cooper, who was shot by the arrow, lowered his body slightly. His skull turned left and right, as if he was looking for the position of the enemy with his eyes that were only left with two big holes. From this, one could see the difference between the two skeletons. Rala's reaction was faster and more accurate. He could determine the enemy's position in a flash and immediately respond to it. Cooper, on the other hand, was similar to the average mercenary. Although he would subconsciously shrink his exposed body to avoid being pursued, his combat awareness was obviously much worse than Rala's. Tisk, the attacker, saw that he had been identified as the target and could not help but click his tongue in displeasure. Then, two more arrows were shot at Su Xinxing. Probably because of the angle, Louise, who was standing to the side, was not listed as the target. If it were any other time, Su Xinxing wouldn't even bother to dodge these two arrows. However, he was now just a projection of his consciousness. If he was hit by an arrow, it would be troublesome if the network connection was interrupted and he couldn't retrieve his head. So, he moved his body slightly to avoid the two arrows. Perhaps realizing that the arrow could not achieve its goal, the guy who shot the arrow finally stood out from the dark corner. The other party was dressed like a mercenary from another world. He wore inferior leather armor that seemed to be poorly made and softened. There was a bow on his back and a quiver of arrows on his waist. Judging from the feathers on his tail, there were probably 2 or 3 arrows left. At this time, he was holding a Scottish Highland two-handed sword that was more common on the battlefield in the middle of the 15th century on Earth. Even the spherical hilt and the wide crossguard were similar in shape. Su Xinxing even thought that he might have traveled back to ancient Earth. Well, if it were not for Louise's hair color, which did not exist on Earth, and the hostile mercenary's next action, the guy took out a smoke-like object from a small waist bag behind his quiver and smeared it on the blade. As soon as the gray substance came into contact with the metal blade, it immediately fused with it. The body of the great sword glowed with an orange light, just like a piece of iron that had just been taken out of the forge. When it was swung, sparks would float from it. At first glance, it gave people the impression that the great sword was quite powerful. With a single hand, the other party brandished the large sword that was about 2 centimeters long. The flying sparks illuminated the other party's dark and weather-beaten face, accompanied by a sinister smile, the cold, killing intent that was unique to mercenaries who licked blood on the edge of their blades faintly spread out. Rala sneaked over to Cooper's neck. Well, at least let him finish his act. Regarding this, Su Xinxing could only curl his lips and silently criticize in his heart. However, everything did not end there. Rala quickly turned around and rushed toward the dark tunnel entrance, but it was still a step too late. A sharp-spiked mace smashed out from the darkness. This weapon, produced in India in the 18th century, was a typical blunt weapon with 118 independent points. It was the weapon of the Marathas. They used this ancient weapon to defeat the British East India Company's army at Wardgorn in 1779. Obviously, this blunt weapon was far more damaging to skeletons than sharp weapons. Rala, who could not completely avoid the blow, was sent flying because its weight was far lighter than a human's. The bones on its wrist were broken. Fortunately, Cooper finally found the enemy and rushed toward the second mercenary wielding his cookery knife. "Are they okay?" It seemed that Louise was still a little worried about the combat power of her skeletons. Well, there are only 3 mercenaries in the tunnel, including the one whose neck was slit. In addition to the spiked mace, there is one who uses a flanged mace. Su Xinxing looked calm, but at least they can hold on for a while. A flanged spiked hammer is one with raised edges on the hammerhead, usually 7. It looked a bit like a paladin's warhammer, but in fact, it originated in Europe in the 16th century. It was a weapon that gradually evolved from a cavalry hammer. "Aren't you going to help?" Louise looked at Su Xinxing expectantly. "If I'm killed, some of your requests can't be fulfilled. Maybe you won't even be able to appear in this world." "Don't make fun of me. I know what to say." Su Xinxing chuckled. Then he turned his head and punched the air. In the next moment, a man wrapped in black cloth suddenly appeared there and was sent flying. However, the man's skills were not bad. He managed to stabilize himself in a panic and did not turn into a mural on the stone wall. In his hand was an Indian catter short sword, which was commonly known as a fist sword. This guy took advantage of the fact that the man wielding the large sword had attracted the attention of most of the people present. His goal seemed to be to assassinate Louise directly. After all, this girl's background was clearly written on the wanted poster. She was a wizard who could control the undead. As long as they could kill her directly, the undead would lose their source of magic and naturally disappear. Therefore, these mercenaries wanted to use this kind of decapitation plan. It was best if they could shoot her dead in the beginning. Otherwise, they would let the man wielding the large sword attract attention and let the assassins secretly kill Louise. However, there was a small accident that caused the mercenaries to suffer heavy losses. They had no choice but to let the backup take the position of the large sword and attack to attract attention. She didn't die? Su Xinxing, who was unaware of this, blinked his eyes. He was not satisfied with the effect of his punch. Although he did not want to be splashed with blood, he did not expect the other party to be able to act as if nothing had happened. This made him a little surprised. An attack of the undead? The man looked at the gemstone ring on his hand that had lost its luster and stared at Su Xinxing vigilantly. A dark warrior with special abilities? I didn't expect a little girl to summon such a troublesome thing. However, the next moment, the blade of the fist sword in his hand suddenly shot towards a girl. "But you're still too young." Chapter 578. The situation was dire. At that moment, the blade of the fist sword was less than a meter away from Louise. As an ordinary girl who had only learned a little about necromancy, Louise had no ability to react in time. Her 2 skeletons were also a few meters away and had no ability to rescue her in time. Louise had never felt so close to death. She could even see the cold gleam of the blade and the smug expression on the assassin's face. "Heh!" Su Xinxing casually swatted away the sharp blade. The granite that had been shot to the side produced sparks before it bounced off. Finally, it pierced deeply between the assassin's eyebrows, whose smug expression had yet to fade away. There was a splashing sound as the assassin's head exploded like a watermelon hit by a bullet. Unknown red, white, and yellow fluid splattered all over the ground along with bone fragments. Although Louise had been fighting a battle of wits and courage with her pursuers for a long time, and had even let her skeletons kill enemies before, this was the first time she had seen such an explosive scene at such a close distance. She could not help but vomit. Wah, I wanted to leave him alive. Su Xinxing, who had seen even more exciting and juicy scenes than this, didn't feel anything out of the ordinary. He just felt that the other party was quite unlucky. He had already shown mercy, but he was still hit by a ricochet and died just like that. He couldn't be any more dead. Fortunately, even if he failed here, there were still 2 skeletons he could use to get information. Thus, he turned around to see if he could find time to grab someone from the skeletons. In the end, he found that the 2 skeletons were already lying on the ground. The skeleton called Cooper was still using his kukri to chop off the heads of the corpses, as if he was afraid that they were not completely dead. Although Su Xinxing was surprised that Louise's 2 skeletons were stronger than he had expected, it was an unbelievable situation for someone who had fought thousands of battles. However, he quickly thought of the reason behind it. Everyone knew that skeletons existed because of the necromancers who provided them with magic. As long as the necromancer died, these unnaturally formed skeletons that were summoned through magic would become harmless skeletons. Thus, when they saw that their companion was about to kill Louise, the 2 mercenaries with heavy weapons relaxed slightly. When Su Xinxing suddenly struck the assassin's head, the 2 mercenaries who had been paying attention were naturally stunned. The skeleton's battle was basically unaffected by external factors unless the necromancer was GG. In addition, their previous weak performance was mostly due to the fact that their battle instincts had yet to adapt to their light bodies. Taking advantage of the enemy's sluggish state, the skeletons directly sent them on their way. After all, a real battle wasn't like a game. In this world where supernatural elements weren't too strong, being cut didn't just result in a little HP loss, it was the same as being in real life. Once a vital part was cut, no matter how skilled the person was, only death awaited them. Thus, in reality, this kind of battle was almost always ended quickly. It was basically impossible to fight for 3 days and 3 nights in a wuxia game. TSK, I wanted to get some more information. In the end, Su Xinxing could only sigh at the few corpses that were about to be chopped into minced meat. Lord, evil God, do you have any information you want to know? Louise, who had almost vomited her gallbladder, finally caught her breath. She tried hard to look away, no longer looking at the headless corpses and the minced meat on the ground. She asked Su Xinxing somewhat weakly. Compared to the somewhat casual feeling before, she was clearly much more respectful to Su Xinxing now. It was probably because Su Xinxing's cruel methods had frightened her, allowing her to confirm Su Xinxing's identity as the evil god. Didn't you say before that there aren't many people in this world with supernatural powers? Su Xinxing didn't correct her thoughts, and only asked her, but in this mercenary group of 4, there are 2 people who can use special abilities, right? First, there was the first person who held the Scottish Highland 2-handed greatsword. He seemed to be able to attach some kind of alchemy powder to the sword, giving it an enchantment effect. Then there was the hitman who could hide in the shadows. Among them, the hitman mainly showed the ability to move in stealth, block a fatal attack for himself with a prop, and use some kind of special energy to shoot blades. I'm not too sure, but they should be a small mercenary group. If they take the elite route, it's not impossible to obtain supernatural powers through alchemy and magical props. Louise guessed with uncertainty. If a large mercenary group had discovered us, we would have been surrounded by hundreds of people, not just 4. Just a few hundred people. I could have surrounded them all by myself. In response, Su Xinxing pursed his lips noncommittally. Apart from what he said, he also wanted to see if what Louise said before was true through the description of the common sense of this world, and use it to determine his future actions. Of course, it would be even better if he could ask where his head was. Evil god, won't you interrogate their souls or something? The girl asked with trepidation. I'm not in charge of that. Well, the evil god Mo Lee is the expert in this field. Su Xinxing continued to talk nonsense with a straight face. Fortunately, Su Xinxing didn't care about this small matter. Since he couldn't get the information he wanted from the captives, he might as well go out and see the world with his own eyes. Take off these dead people's clothes and change into them. Su Xinxing kicked the headless corpse. Evil god, isn't your wish to revive your family? If that's the case, you won't be able to accomplish it by hiding in this place, right? Hearing Su Xinxing's words, the girl hesitated for a moment, and then her gaze became firm. But I'm a girl? Won't it feel weird to wear this kind of male mercenary leather armor and people find out? Even so, Louise still asked anxiously. It's okay. Su Xinxing calmly gave her a thumbs up and comforted her. I guarantee with my own divinity, with your figure and appearance, no one will find out. I don't think that's a compliment, evil god. Louise wanted to cry, but no tears came out. She checked her chest but found nothing. Chapter 579. After putting on the exotic leather armor over his clothes, Su Xinxing nodded with satisfaction. Very good, very natural. No, it's not natural at all. The breastplate already covers the abdomen. Louise couldn't help but complain. She also put on the hitman's leather armor. Although she looked a little bloated, she was unexpectedly handsome. Her short green hair had been dyed orange red with some kind of potion, and she looked a lot livelier. F*CK, can I wear it as a full body armor? Su Xinxing, who had achieved 100% success in being ridiculed, replied indifferently. After all, they were of different races. Even Su Xinxing couldn't turn himself into a muscular man who was 5 meters tall, and could use a two-handed Scottish Highland sword as a dagger. And compared to this, isn't there a bigger problem? Su Xinxing turned his head to look at the two skeletons. Even with the leather armor, they still looked empty. Even if they were wrapped in cloth, it didn't create the feeling of a living person. Lola can do the same thing as the hitman just now. As long as there are no white-robed clerics, basically no one can discover her stealth. Louise thought and suggested, As for Cooper, can't we let him stay here? If you don't mind, of course, I have no objection. Su Xinxing replied noncommittally, but since someone has already come to find us, I think you should take the fact that this place is already exposed into consideration. Ugh, that's true, the very tomboyish girl muttered in distress. It seems that we can only temporarily leave him in a more hidden place outside the city. After discussing the countermeasures, the group left the cave where they were hiding and went to the outside world. Although they didn't know when they came to this world, it was now night. Looking at the night sky from near the mountainside, they could see the river of stars that seemed to be flowing. 2 blue and red moons, one big and one small, lined up in the night sky. Because the brightness or the degree of reflection of sunlight was not as high as the moon on Earth. Even in the presence of the 2 moons, they could still see the sky, full of stars. It was a unique romance of this world. There are actually 2 moons, Su Xinxing muttered with great interest. The red moon is called the scarlet moon, and the blue one is called the tranquil moon. It's rare for them to appear together. From the perspective of astrology, this kind of astrology is very suitable for some special ceremonies. I tried to summon you because of the 2 moons, but I didn't expect it to succeed. Louise also raised her head to look at the brilliant river of stars, as well as the 2 magnificent moons in the river of stars. Her voice sounded somewhat ethereal. Oh, although I've long felt that Lord Evil God isn't interested in magic, isn't this a little too cold? Because of Su Xinxing's indifference, the girl could not help but sigh. I'm really sorry. Su Xinxing thought to himself, I'm the successor of socialism. All the monsters are paper tigers. all the incredible things can be explained by physics, and the things that can't be explained can also be solved by physics. And although there were things like astrology in ancient times, and even in modern times, people were superstitious about constellations. But if you thought about it carefully, all the astrology was just a star tens of thousands of light years away. Su Xinxing himself had been to the colony of an alien civilization, and for him, there was nothing special about the astrology at all. Unless it was the kind of mini-world where the sky was round and all the stars were projections of gods, this would not change even in this world. This is the first time I've heard such an unreflective apology, the girl muttered while walking on the rugged mountain path. I'm really sorry. So Su Xinxing changed to a handstand position with only his little finger and repeated what he just said. No, I don't mean the posture. Forget it. I always feel that Lord Evil God's way of thinking is very different from that of ordinary humans. I don't know if there's a difference. Su Xinxing exerted force with his finger, and his whole body bounced up like a spring, then landed steadily and returned to his previous standing position. Then he looked back. But the choice we made was right. Huh! The girl followed Su Xinxing's gaze and looked over. In the end, she discovered that on the small slope in front of the cave entrance, which was quite a distance away from them, many figures had appeared faintly. Are they mercenaries? Louise almost reflexively crouched down, trying to hide her figure with the help of the weeds. Unfortunately, they're not. Although Su Xinxing's senses were quite subpar, it depended on who he was compared to. Compared to Louise, whose senses were only at the level of an ordinary person, Su Xinxing's senses were already shockingly powerful. Even if the moonlight was much weaker than on Earth, the hazy night still could not obstruct Su Xinxing's vision, allowing him to clearly see the things on the slope. They were not humans, but dolls made of unknown materials. They had no facial features or organs, and were so white that it was a little disgusting. They were holding all kinds of cold weapons and waiting at the entrance of the cave. Some of the puppets even sneaked into the cave with the help of other puppets. Although they have the basic appearance of a human, their faces are completely white, and there's room for a complete face. Their reaction is not human. Or rather, it's questionable whether they can even be considered living beings. According to the feedback from Yunlin's senses, they should have a life reaction. But that reaction was very awkward. Should it be inferior or full of dissonance? All in all, it was not a good feeling. Dolls. That should be the work of the Ain's Shuhua family, Louise said softly. Ain Shuhua? Yes, a rare magic family. It's said that their ancestor was once a disciple of a great sage, and they inherited the great sage's puppet magic. They even have the legendary long-lost skill of creating alchemical life. Alchemical life? That would explain everything. Su Xinxing pondered for a moment, then asked, They came to find you, which means that they have already made contact with the church you mentioned before? The Ain's Shuhua usually live in seclusion. Their philosophy is to pass down the knowledge of the great sage, so to be honest, I'm very surprised that their skill appeared here. Chapter 580. Although Su Xinxing was very interested in the alchemical life form, he still remembered his main purpose and did not cause any trouble. He quickly left with Louise. In fact, during the process, he also had the idea that even if he did not go looking for them, according to the protagonist's plot armor, those guys should have come looking for him. Unfortunately, until they completely left the mountains, there was no trace of them following them. It seemed that the Ain's Shuhua family's puppet did not have a high ability value. Suddenly, old Su's interest in that thing decreased a lot. Because Louise was wanted by her original country, if he wanted to rebuild the Reedman family, he had to start from other countries. Su Xinxing's main purpose was to find his head. However, the Reedman family's territory was overthrown by a peasant uprising, and the family's original residence was almost completely looted. Naturally, his head was lost in the chaos. Even though he had coaxed and pestered the girl back to her hometown, Su Xinxing was unable to sense his own head while the girl was reminiscing about the past. It seemed that he had indeed been sent to a rather distant place. This kind of search was like looking for a needle in a haystack. In order to find it, he needed to have a certain degree of power. After all, no matter how powerful Su Xinxing was, there was a limit to the places he could search alone. After knowing this, he decided to let the girl establish her own power as soon as possible. Although Su Xinxing's strength had deteriorated severely, it was not a problem for him to confront the country that wanted the girl, mainly the Vatican. However, this would often cause more trouble. Once, Su Xinxing arrived in a certain lattice world in a tough manner, intending to use the fastest speed to integrate the human forces and fight against the powerful Demon King's army in that world. However, he did not expect that his strength could not unite the human forces. Instead, it made the humans who did not know the truth treat him as an evil villain with the ambition to rule the world. In the end, although Su Xinxing still relied on his own stubbornness to break through the lattice world and barely saved it, he did not want to experience the feeling of being the enemy of the whole world again. In order to find a suitable city to settle down in, Su Xinxing traversed more than half of the plains under the guidance of Louise. It could be said that he had seen the true appearance of this world with his own eyes. From the perspective of Su Xinxing, the civilization of this world or this planet seemed to be based on an ancient civilization that had disappeared a long time ago. Even in this plain, there were many traces left behind by the ancient civilization, the wreckage of the huge flying island that had crashed, the artificial underground glaciers, a large number of underground cities, and the ruins of various ancient cities. Su Xinxing had asked Louise about this before, and the answer he got from the girl was that these things originated from the legendary era. The humans of this era firmly believed that before their civilization, there were two other civilizations. The first civilization was called the mythological era. It was said that at that time, humans were spread all over the continent, and there was a highly developed magic civilization. However, after coming into contact with forbidden knowledge, the goddess who created the world brought an unavoidable disaster to humans. Half of the world became a forbidden land for humans. Therefore, under the leadership of the last human leader in the mythological era, they traversed more than half of the continent and finally took root in the eastern plains, where they began to reproduce. However, after the last leader died of illness, humans began to fall apart due to the lack of a leader. It became a situation of many countries and endless war. Fortunately, the two unfriendly neighbors on both sides of the plain did not consume much of the fighting power of humans. Soon, the war subsided. After humans settled down, the prosperous era was called the legendary era. Although it was not as good as the mythological era, there were still many powerful magicians in the legendary era. Humans defeated the orcs and elves in war after war, and gradually became the most powerful race. Even the demons from the abyss could not stop the development of humans. They could only live in the territory that was divided by humans. However, it was precisely this power that made some people lose their minds. They proposed the slogan of crossing the cliffs in the west and the Gale Plateau to reclaim the homeland of mankind. What was worse was that some kings also responded to this slogan in order to leave their names in the history books. Therefore, the punishment of the goddess appeared again. The terrible disaster almost engulfed the entire human race in an instant. Fortunately, that era was also an era of heroes. A group of heroes, led by the most powerful magicians, bravely resisted the disaster. In the end, with their efforts, humans were left with a glimmer of hope. Although the names of those heroes disappeared in the disaster, their courage was like a bright light guiding the surviving humans to work hard to rebuild human society and restore the ancient glory. However, I don't know if it was because of the aftermath of the disaster, but after the collapse of the originally glorious magic civilization, no matter how hard the humans of this era tried, there was no way to restore the great magic power of the past. It was as if the magic power of the world had disappeared with the disaster. At the end of the story, Louise could not help but show an emotional expression. It is said that whether it was the mythological era or the legendary era, the necromancers could stand side by side with the heroes and contribute their meager strength to the human race. Humans were adopted by the goddess, right? After listening to her story, this was Su Xinxing's first reaction. Why do I always feel like she treats humans like a stepmother? Lord Evil God, it's fine if you say this to me. Remember not to talk nonsense when we reach the city. It will be very troublesome if the believers of the church hear it. Louise sighed and said helplessly. Along the way, she was almost used to this unreliable evil god's unreliable remarks. If this world had a skill system, perhaps her ability to retort would have been maxed out. I can be considered to be experienced and knowledgeable, but I've never seen a god who doesn't allow people to travel. Su Xinxing continued to retort in his own way. Sigh, the girl began to regret telling Su Xinxing the story of the mythological era. At this moment, they finally reached the top of the high slope. Suddenly, the originally continuous hills in front of them changed, and their vision suddenly opened up. In front of them was an indescribably huge sinkhole, and in this sinkhole was a rather neatly planned and majestic city. We're finally here. Louise's face revealed a joyful expression. The neutral city of Lomosi. Chapter 581. Is this place really the permanently neutral land you speak of? Standing at the edge of the sinkhole, Su Xinxing gazed into the distance for a moment before asking with a doubtful expression, "If I must say, the surrounding towns and villages are all under Luomosi's administration and belong to the neutral lands." Louise, who didn't know the reason, answered honestly, "It's not that I'm being paranoid." Su Xinxing gazed at the city that seemed to have sunk into the ground and asked doubtfully, "But this city doesn't look like one that can stay out of the disputes between human nations." Generally speaking, there were two types of situations for a region to be called a neutral land. The first type was that it was located in a desolate and remote place. Add to that the fact that it didn't produce any special products that contained great benefits such as minerals, spices, and the like. It was extremely inconvenient, both in terms of transportation and transportation. There was no value in conquering it, and as time passed, it was ignored by all nations and became a neutral land that was unregulated. A considerable number of fugitives and scoundrels who had committed crimes in their own countries would gather in such a place. Rather than calling it a neutral land, it was more accurate to call it a lawless land of chaos. Su Xinxing wouldn't be surprised if it really was such a place. On the contrary, it would be better to say that things were simpler and clearer. Those fugitives could be easily suppressed by force. Even if there were those who didn't want to submit, they would become as obedient as loyal dogs after being punished a few times as an example to others. After becoming the uncrowned king there, many things would become much easier to do. The only troublesome thing was that the scum wouldn't do their best to complete the tasks they were given, and their efficiency was relatively low. Add to that the geographical limitations of the region itself, this kind of inefficient situation would worsen. To put it bluntly, this so-called neutral land was of little value that was tasteless to eat, but a pity to throw away. Be it in terms of geography or the streets of the city called Luomosi, it didn't look like a chaotic land at all. Yes, of course, it was true that transportation wasn't convenient. In that case, it should belong to the second type of situation. The second type of situation had nothing to do with location or size of territory. There was only one reason it could become a neutral existence: strength. Only with great power, whether it was individual power that had broken through the limit of numbers or a certain military class that had great combat power, after having power that exceeded a certain limit, could maintain their own independent will and become a completely neutral existence. This kind of neutrality was more valuable. Whether it was the strength of an individual or a combat group with considerable deterrence, the fact that this independent force could maintain its existence for a long time showed that this government had its own set of effective ways of doing things. In addition, most of the small countries had the kind of cohesion that was unique to them. If he could join them, or even get a high position, it would be of great help to Su Xinxing in his search for the leader. However, the problem was that this kind of sunken terrain was too disadvantageous for the defenders. It was hard to imagine that it could deter the surrounding countries. Putting everything else aside, as long as the attackers surrounded the top of the cliff and shot down a volley of lit arrows, it would be enough to cause a considerable amount of chaos. If they were a bit more vicious and drew water from a distant river here, it wouldn't be long before the Sinkhole City would become a swamp country. It would already be pretty good if a tenth of them could survive. Unless one was as powerful as Su Xinxing, individual martial power and the combat power of an army wouldn't be of much use in this kind of situation. That was why Su Xinxing found it hard to believe. Luomosai is the only city protected by magic. Whether it's a water attack or a fire, it won't be affected at all. Although it can't be seen with the naked eye, there's actually a layer of barrier at the top of the sinkhole. That's a protective barrier passed down from the legendary era. Even now, there hasn't been a way to break it. Louise, who knew that Su Xinxing didn't even have some common knowledge about this world, hurriedly explained. So that's how it is. There's a supernatural power protecting it. Su Xinxing nodded in understanding. Perhaps only a supernatural power that defied common sense could turn a city like this into a neutral land. Lord Evil God? Seeing Su Xinxing's thoughtful expression, the girl cautiously called out to him. It's nothing, don't worry about it. Su Xinxing waved his hand. Since this city's defenses are so strict, it won't be that easy to enter its interior and even infiltrate its upper echelons, right? Yes, but fortunately the city lord's residence in Luomosai issued an order some time ago. When it came to matters related to reviving her family, the girl seemed to be in high spirits. In fact, a thief has infiltrated Luomosai. He's been committing crimes crazily during this time and has already burgled the residences of the Luomosai family's officials and nobles. However, the guards in Luomosai can't find any information about this person at all. Is that so? Su Xinxing didn't comment on this. He really wasn't interested in strange thieves. 2 days ago, even the city lord's residence lost something. That's why the originally arrogant city lord's residence reluctantly issued a notice, wanting to mobilize the people of Luomosai to capture that thief together. The girl didn't notice Su Xinxing's lack of interest and continued speaking in a rather excited tone. They promised that as long as we find that thief, we'll immediately be conferred the title of honorary baron. We'll directly enter the upper class of Luomosai. As long as they could enter the upper class and show their faces in front of the city lord of Luomosai, it wouldn't be a bad choice whether it was to earn money, farm, or find a way to obtain their own land. The only problem now was that they hoped that the thief wouldn't be caught by others before they found the culprit. For some reason, Louise didn't realize at all that she had a strange trust in this strange Lord Evil God she'd summoned. I'll ask for the time being. Most of the things that were lost were those shiny gold products, right? Su Xinxing suddenly asked. There were also things like gems. Louise was stunned for a moment before replying. Yes, I think I've found out who the culprit is. Su Xinxing looked at a big black bird that was soaring not far away with a playful expression on his face. So fast. Chapter 582. Kronos was the Minister of Internal Affairs of the neutral country, Luomoxi. Compared to the other officials, he could stay in the city lord's mansion for a long time. In a sense, he was closer to the city lord and was also the target of many people's flattery. As a matter of fact, he did hold a considerable amount of authority. Other than the solemn and rigid personal guards, he did not fear any other officials in the city. However, at this moment, this minister, who could be regarded as second only to the city lord, had also fallen into a considerable degree of dilemma. Everything stemmed from the sudden theft that happened some time ago. At first, the culprit only targeted some of the nobles. Even if those people had any opinions, they would only target the city guards and officials. It had nothing to do with him. Naturally, Kronos would not ask for trouble and get himself involved in these matters. In the end, He did not expect that the culprit would be so bold as to steal from the city lord's mansion. Even some of the precious jewelry that the city lord usually cherished were stolen. Immediately, Kronos arranged for his subordinates to investigate this matter. However, no matter how hard they investigated, they could not find any trace or clue of the culprit. It was as if the culprit was an invisible ghost. No matter how he looked at it, it seemed to be the masterpiece of those amazing people who possessed extraordinary powers. However, even Kronos would not believe that those arrogant people would commit such a disgraceful act of theft. As long as they revealed their identity and demonstrated their abilities, there would be a lot of nobles who would invite them to be their guests, or even court mages. As time went by, there was still no progress in the case. Although the city lord had not yet blamed him, if there were no changes, his political opponents would definitely not hesitate to attack him. Those who coveted his position would also kick him when he was down. So, the top priority now was to find the culprit. For this reason, he did not hesitate to split a part of the property under his name and applied for a baron title from the city lord as a reward for the person who caught the culprit. After all, he could intervene and manage most of the affairs in Luamisili. If the one who received the reward was just a powerless commoner, he could just find a random reason to take back the property from the other party after the storm calmed down after some time. If it had been another noble who had caught the thief in the end, then the loss of his property would not have been a huge blow to him. He could just treat it as an investment to build a good relationship with the other party. Therefore, after the Castellans sent back the application form with the word approved, Kronos announced a reward that would allow a normal person to soar to the sky. Instantly, the responders rushed to the top like a flock of ducks. This was not surprising. In this era, the channels to rise up were basically controlled by the nobles. Uneducated commoners had very few opportunities to rise up. It was precisely because of this that the reward this time caused such a huge uproar. He thought that it wouldn't be difficult to find the culprit in such a situation where almost everyone was mobilized. But in the blink of an eye, a week had passed. Although many people enthusiastically reported suspicious people and even gave false information about the criminals after verification, none of them were the real culprits. On the other hand, many thieves were directly sent to the guard camp because of this incident, which boosted the public security in Luomoxi. It was estimated that the ones who hated the culprit the most now were not the guards, but the other petty thieves who were implicated by the incident. As for the idea of finding a scapegoat to fool the Castellan, it was not that Kronos had never thought of it before, but every time this thought surfaced, he would wisely extinguish it. Although the Castellan wasn't too interested in the management of the affairs in the city, as long as his subordinates didn't mess things up too badly, he would almost never intervene in the management. But that didn't mean that the Castellan was easy to fool. In fact, the Castellan was smarter than anyone else. Although he seemed to be lazy all the time, his sleepy eyes were sharp enough to see through everything. No one had ever been able to play tricks in front of the Castellan. The reason why Kronos was able to take up this position wasn't because of how talented he was. In fact, in terms of talent, the previous two Castellans were far better than him. However, many people had a problem. After obtaining a certain degree of power, their ambition would further expand, and they would want to seize more power. They would even have a contemptuous attitude toward the leader who delegated power to them, thinking that the leader wouldn't be able to see through their tricks of abusing power for personal gain. It was the same for the other two. They felt that they could cover the sky with one hand and began to curry favor. If it were any other monarch, there was an 80% chance that they would be overthrown and succeed, causing the country to be in a foul atmosphere. But this Castellan was different. He killed the two of them with thunderous means. That's right, he killed them. Kronos felt that he would never forget that tragic scene for the rest of his life. However, the Castellan knew the crimes of the two like the back of his hand. After killing them, he announced their crimes one by one, making it so that no one dared to resist him. It was precisely because of this that, even though Kronos was a little greedy, he definitely wouldn't use any messy means to fool the Castellan. Lord Kronos. While Kronos was still immersed in his thoughts, an attendant came up to him. Someone claimed to have found the culprit. Is it true? I don't know. The attendant looked a little awkward. Kronos, on the other hand, didn't look too happy. Didn't I tell you? Unless you verify the authenticity, you don't have to report to me. If it's a fake, just break one of his legs and throw him out. Ugh, that's where the problem lies. The attendant looked even more awkward. He said softly, "We can't beat him." Kronos was shocked to hear that, but soon he returned to his calm self. What about the city guards? That man has taken down 2 large groups of them. There should be a few more groups on their way here, but the man seems to have plenty of time to spare. He even posed in a strange posture and said something like, "I want to take on 10 of them." It wasn't that there weren't any ordinary people who could take on a group of city guards alone, but the man who could do it so easily was most likely not an ordinary person. Could it be that someone with extraordinary powers had entered Luomashi? Kronos was having a headache, but he still looked extremely calm on the surface. I'll go out and have a look. If necessary, I'll use words to calm him down. Hurry up and inform the guards of the Castellan. Tell them to inform the Castellan. Yes, sir. The attendant quickly left Kronos' office. Only then did Flono's face crumble. Damn it. Am I that unlucky to be involved in the battle of those strange people? Chapter 583. Seriously, Xiao Jingyi looked at Su Xinxing, who was lying on the table, and sighed deeply. Does this guy always fall asleep so suddenly that he can't be woken up? This is the first time. Qin Xingyan looked a little worried. I don't know when Senior will wake up. That's really troublesome. Xiao Jingyi's shoulders slumped even more, and he looked very depressed. Are you in any trouble? Qin Xingyan asked. Don't look at me like this. I'm actually very busy. The previous big case made the police station a mess. I took the time to come here to ask about this guy. Xiao Jingyi complained in distress. What should I do if this continues? Mr. Xiao, don't you already have some guesses? Whether it's a curse or a devil's deal, Senior's pocket watch should be used by the other party to determine the target's coordinates. After all, as Senior's personal belongings, the pocket watch should have been tainted with Senior's aura. Qin Xingyan said. You heard everything? Xiao Jingyi looked stunned. When he and Su Xinxing were talking about the prisoners and the pocket watch, Qin Xingyan and Mo Li should have been on the other side of the living room. Because of the unexpected situation, I have stronger senses than before. As a part of my senses, my hearing has also been strengthened. The girl smiled apologetically, but she did not intend to let Xiao Jingyi brush off the topic. She continued to stare straight at him, making the latter's hair stand on end. Although Xiao Jingyi had the Yuan Rong sword to protect him, he was still just an ordinary person. Being stared at by Qin Xingyan, who was almost like a celestial being, naturally made him feel a sense of fear. This was the same as when ordinary people faced natural disasters, such as tornadoes. Even if they did not have the relevant knowledge, they would still feel fear. It was the most basic instinctive reaction of living creatures, engraved in their genetic chain. All right, I'll be honest. Therefore, Xiao Zhengyi, who was very sensible, immediately raised his hands in surrender and replied with a wry smile, Actually, it's not something that can't be discussed openly. Other than delivering the information to Old Sue, I also received another mission from the Bureau. At the very least, I need to know what the thing that turned those people who were originally just migrant workers into powerful monsters is, and judging from all the clues we have so far, Old Sue is probably the only one who can solve this problem, right? Qin Xingyan thought for a moment, then suddenly raised his head. I think you have another direction to investigate. What? Xiao Jingyi was taken aback. Aren't the weapons that those people have all firearms? Qin Xingyan continued, since you can strengthen your body through magic or curses, there's no reason why you can't strengthen your weapons as well. Regardless of whether it's the East or the West, the difficulty of spirit enhancement on inanimate objects is far lower than the difficulty of doing the same thing on living creatures. So, you suspect that the person who provided the weapons was not the existence that strengthened them, but another group of people. Xiao Zhengyi had a thoughtful expression on his face. Yes, that's what I think. Qin Xingyan nodded. Even the actions of taking hostages and robbing banks could be the actions of the other party. Things are getting complicated all of a sudden. Xiao Zhengyi's face became more wrinkled, and he looked like he had a headache. Although neither of them pointed out that the people who could obtain such a large number of weapons in the Celestial Empire where guns were banned were either directly recruited by the government or colluded with some foreign forces. To be honest, no matter which aspect it was, the problem was very big. Even Xiao Zhengyi, who had nothing to do with the specific details of the case, he was mainly investigating the supernatural circumstances of the case, and the case itself was not under the jurisdiction of the Super-Administrative Office, began to feel his stomach ache. Actually, it's not completely useless to be a little more complicated. The more complicated a conspiracy is, the more aspects that need to be taken care of. Just like a ball of yarn, the more complicated it is, the more threads that need to be wound around it, and the more threads that may be exposed, the more likely it is that the ball of yarn will be unraveled, right? Qin Xingyan said very leisurely. Even so, Xiao Zhengyi sighed again. This time, he stood up from the sofa and put the hat on his head. Forget it. Anyway, I'll go back to the Super-Administrative Office first. When old Su wakes up, give me a call. If Su Xinxing did not wake up, it was not a good idea to continue staying in Sakura Apartments. Moreover, Qin Xingyan's words made Xiao Zhengyi vaguely think of something, but he had to go back and discuss the specific details with Su Feng. With this thought in mind, he left Sakura Apartment with ease after saying that. Xiao Sang has already left? Asahi Sakura Kanji exclaimed in surprise as she walked out of the kitchen with a plate piled with bacon, fried eggs, and Vienna sausages. Then she looked at Su Xinxing, who was still lying on the table. By the way, those spirit ghosts seemed to have realized that they had caused trouble and had already run away. It was likely that other than Su Xinxing himself, no one else could catch those spirit ghosts who did not have any physical structure. Emily might be able to, but obviously, that little guy's mind was not on this matter at the moment. Mr. Landlord still shows no signs of waking up. As you can see, if it weren't for Senpai's ability to evade all detection methods, I would have thought that he... Qin Xingyan scratched his face embarrassedly. Just now, he almost killed those spirit ghosts. Killed. Asahi Sakura Kanji showed a startled expression. At this time, she suddenly felt as if someone was tugging at the corner of her clothes. Asahi Sakura Kanji, who was already a little startled, was naturally startled, but she soon found out that it was Emily who was tugging at her. Miss Emily, what's wrong? She squatted down and asked Emily, porridge. Emily replied word by word. Oh, right. Emily, do you know what happened to Senpai? Qin Xingyan, who remembered that Su Xinxing and Emily were in some sense of the same mind, hurriedly asked. Just a small matter, Emily answered after a moment of hesitation, and then said to Asahi Sakura Kanji, teach me how to cook porridge. If Miss Emily wants to eat porridge, I can cook more for you? Asahi Sakura Kanji expressed her confusion. This time, Mr. Landlord might wake up very late. Emily tilted her head and said cutely, so I want to cook porridge for him myself. Of course, no problem. Asahi Sakura Kanji, who was almost turned from a fujoshi to a lesbian by Emily's cute expression, hurriedly answered. Then the two went into the kitchen together, leaving Qin Xingyan, who was smiling bitterly, to take care of Su Xinxing, who was fast asleep. Chapter 584. You're the one who said you found the wanted thief? As soon as Kronos walked out of the small castle that was used as the castellan's manor, he saw the person that the servant mentioned. As a matter of fact, the person was very conspicuous and didn't seem to want to hide. Instead, the person stood on the thick oak plank bridge that could be retracted by the winch to be used as the city gate. At that moment, Kronos had the urge to inform the servants in the castellan's manor to lift the wooden bridge and see if they could shut the person out. However, The fallen city guards told Kronos that the person wasn't someone to be trifled with. If he were to simply use such a method to anger the person, it would be troublesome. Fortunately, judging from the fact that the city guards were still panting in pain, the young man with the unusual hair color didn't go all out. Since there was still room for negotiation, everything would be fine. Otherwise, Kronos could only place his hopes on the magical barrier in Lomosi that was said to be able to isolate hostile people. After confirming his judgment, Kronos tried his best to hide the uneasiness and fear in his heart. Then he pretended to be calm, walked towards the person, and braced himself. Finally, there's someone who can make decisions. When the person saw Kronos, the bored expression on his face vanished instantly and was replaced by a playful smile. This man is really something. Looking at the flawless way the person responded, Kronos thought to himself, "Since you're here to complete the Castellan's request, please come in. I'll instruct my men to give you the highest level of courtesy." As soon as Kronos said that, he realized that he seemed to have made a fool of himself. He quickly tried to salvage the situation. "Of course, I'm only representing myself." Fortunately, the person didn't seem to understand the meaning behind Kronos' words. He raised his brow and revealed a faint smile. "The highest level of courtesy, huh?" The person glanced at the city guards on the ground and let out a short hee. Although Kronos didn't know what the hee-hee meant due to his professional sensitivity, he realized that it wasn't a compliment. "Unfortunately, I'm not the one who responded to the Castellan's call this time. Instead, it's my—" The person paused for a while, as though he was searching for the right word. "Yes, boss." Kronos looked in the direction of his gesture and realized that there was another person standing not far away. It was also a young man, but he was much younger than the black-haired, half-bald young man who defeated several teams of city guards. Although the other party's attire was rather gender-neutral, Kronos's eyes were quite sharp. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to get to the rank of an internal affairs minister so easily. He could see through the person's disguise as a man. "Boss." Kronos chewed on the word and roughly analyzed some information from it. First of all, the cross-dressing young lady should be the black-haired, half-bald young man's superior. However, the subordinate relationship between them wasn't strict and close. Otherwise, the man wouldn't have introduced her in such a casual tone. Besides, from the way he addressed her, it was apparent that the man didn't have much respect for the young lady. Even though he was her subordinate in name, he still maintained his self-esteem as an extraordinary person and wouldn't address her as master. It went to show that the young lady's strength should be far inferior to man. It was also apparent from the fact that she stood aside and didn't intervene in the previous battle. "I see. Please forgive my rudeness." At this thought, Kronos bowed slightly and apologized. As a matter of fact, he couldn't be blamed. After all, the presence of the man standing in the mountain of corpses and sea of blood was too strong. It was normal for him to subconsciously ignore the cross-dressing young lady beside him. "It's fine." The young lady returned the bow immediately. "Or rather, I'd like to apologize for ordering my subordinates to trespass into the Castellan's mansion." Her movements were standard and elegant. It was apparent that she wasn't the kind of person who sharpened her spear at the last minute. Instead, she had accumulated quite a lot of experience and habits. It seemed that this young lady was from a noble family, and her father was most likely from a rather large noble family. In this case, it wasn't strange for her to have such a powerful person as her bodyguard. "Then, please come in. I think the Castellan will be happy." The young lady and the young man looked at each other. The young man nodded. Thus, the young lady followed the man into the Castellan's mansion with a somewhat nervous expression. The man followed behind unhurriedly. "I feel that the inside of the castle is more magnificent than what it looks like from the outside," Louise whispered. Indeed, from the outside, the Castellan's mansion was just a rather small castle. No, rather than calling it a castle, it was more like a manor house with a Gothic castle style. The highest point was probably less than 20 meters high, not to mention the length and width. It's some kind of space-expanding spell. Is this world really like what you said, a low-magic world where magic is very rare? Su Shinxing muttered in a low voice as he answered the question. Except for a few special worlds, all space-related technology, whether it was technology or magic, was generally the result of high-end research. If this world was really like what Louise said, and there weren't many magicians, this kind of spectacle should be very rare. Although it's a bit early, can you tell me about the prisoner? Perhaps he felt that the content of Su Shinxing's conversation was a bit too extreme, but the 30-year-old gamer hurriedly interrupted Su Shinxing and Louise's interaction. It's actually not a particularly interesting story. As long as you can see the prisoner once, the truth will be revealed. Su Shinxing didn't intend to hide it and said directly, the large crows in this city seem to have a habit of collecting shiny things. I found the castellan's lost item in a crow's nest. It was the jackdaw's doing. The old man was startled. From his expression, he seemed to be very surprised, but there were many things that weren't shiny metal products among the lost items. Those were probably smaller pieces of cloth, sticks, and other thatch-like things. Su Shinxing casually replied. Although they weren't decorative, they contained the most basic materials to make a bird's nest. Now that you mention it, it does seem to be... Actually, my lord, why are you... Halfway through, Florinos suddenly stopped and looked at the figure that appeared at the end of the corridor with a surprised expression. Chapter 585. While the title of Knight Captain of the Imperial Guard often made people think of tall, powerful, and handsome men, the Knight Captain of Luomosai's Imperial Guard was not like that. She was a valiant blonde with a single ponytail. Speaking of which, her blonde hair wasn't like Jasmine's, which gave people a sparkling feeling. Instead, it was closer to the slightly dull blonde hair of the Europeans on Earth, which didn't have any special effects added to it. However, this did not affect her awe-inspiring temperament. Her waist-length ponytail, which was not suitable for battle in theory, accentuated her shrewdness and ability. She was dressed as luxuriously as the ceremonial robes worn by male nobles when they attended the conferment ceremony. However, at the joints and other places, there were obvious traces of tailoring that did not affect the beauty of the robe. This allowed the robe to not slow down her movements and slow her down. Apart from that, Su Shinxing also sensed something from her that was completely different from the people of this world he had encountered before. It was a kind of energy that could not be seen with the naked eye, constantly surging, and gave Su Shinxing a subtle sense of familiarity. It was magic power. Although it might be different from Emoli's magic power in terms of specific attributes, it was definitely the same thing in essence. Even Louise, who could use necromancy magic to a certain extent, did not sense this kind of energy. Perhaps she had it, but because it was too weak, Su Shinxing's unreliable perception might have overlooked it. If that was the case, then it could be seen from another perspective how immense the magic power of the girl in front of him was. Louise, are you sure that those who stand at the peak of magic and can use so-called great magic are as rare as phoenix feathers and Qilin horns? Su Shinxing could not help but confirm with the girl beside him in a low voice. Louise was still scratching her head in confusion. The number of high-ranked mages who can use great magic is indeed not many, which is why they have become a fighting force that can affect the situation of multiple countries. The Castellan and I are special examples. It's better if you don't treat it as common sense. Unexpectedly, the girl on the other side also heard Su Shinxing and Louise's whispers. She said, "Besides, the peak of magic is not the so-called great magic. Above it, there are miracles and the power that surpasses miracles. That kind of power still exists? Unbelievable." Louise had a surprised expression on her face. Su Shinxing, on the other hand, was somewhat disapproving. However, if the combat power level of this world was 2 levels higher than what he had estimated at the beginning, then he who was now only equivalent to a sword saint who could split a planet with his sword might really encounter some trouble. On the other hand, the old man beside Lord Moxie was shocked after confirming that other than the Castellan, even the captain of the Imperial Knights were powerful mutants. His face was filled with uneasiness, as he was afraid that he would hear a secret that he shouldn't hear and be silenced by a sentence of "you know too much." Fortunately, the head of the guards didn't seem to care. He just waved his hand at him and had him leave. Immediately, Flunos left the place as if he was pardoned. After the old man left, the captain of the guard spoke again. "Then, let me introduce myself." There was a slight smile on her face, but the smile disappeared in a flash. It even made Su Shinxing wonder if he had seen wrongly. "My name is Elisa Edric." "My name is Louise Reedman." Louise also quickly introduced herself. "Su Shinxing." For some reason, Su Shinxing felt that the girl's name was a little familiar. He subconsciously reported his real name. Then, he glanced at Louise and smiled knowingly. He immediately remembered that this girl seemed to have thought of him as the evil god named Olivia. She probably thought that Su Shinxing deliberately reported a fake name to not expose his identity as the evil god. Su Shinxing was a little annoyed by this. After thinking for a moment, he decided to let her be and let her think whatever she wanted. Then Su Shinxing, who came back to his senses, found that the girl named Elisa seemed to be staring at his face. "What's wrong?" Because he wasn't very good at talking, Su Shinxing directly asked, "Is there something wrong with my face?" "No, nothing. I just miss it a little." Elisa's face showed a lonely expression, but she quickly turned around. "Come with me. I'm ordered to bring you directly to the Castellan. Then I'll have to trouble you." Although Su Shinxing felt a little strange about her attitude, he didn't take it to heart. Perhaps because of the enchantment of spatial magic, the interior of the Castellan's mansion was unexpectedly large. From the corridor near the courtyard to the Castellan's residence, they walked for nearly 20 minutes before they arrived at their destination. After knocking on the ironclad wooden door, the heavy door opened by itself, and a spacious study appeared in front of Su Shinxing's eyes. At the south end of the study was a wide ebony desk with a lot of documents and books piled up on it. Behind the desk was a red velvet sofa decorated with many gems on the back. At this time, a little girl with long silver or light blue hair was sitting on the sofa. The little girl's appearance, in a word, was cute. Su Shinxing had seen a lot of girls in his life. Perhaps in terms of beauty, the little girl wasn't ranked number one, but in terms of cuteness, besides Mo Lee and old Su's own daughter, Dunya, this little girl should be ranked third without any suspense. Although this was a little unfair to little Chiketsu. In short, her appearance was the kind of cuteness that completely hit Su Shinxing's strike zone. Well, they really do look alike. Before Su Shinxing could think of a way to speak, the little girl spoke first. Just like her appearance, the girl's voice was a little cold, but it was mixed with a little childish and cute nasal sound. "What do you mean?" So Su Shinxing asked. Then he frowned. The little girl also had a turbulent magic power that was similar to the Knight Captain, but unlike the Knight Captain, the little girl's magic power felt more stiff and gloomy. If Su Shinxing didn't know that this magic power didn't have a consciousness, he was afraid that it would directly be some kind of curse. "My teacher looks very much like you." No, it should be said that except for the hair, they are exactly the same. "I think except for the hair is redundant," Su Shinxing muttered with a dark face. Chapter 586. Although Su Shinxing was dissatisfied with the girl's choice of words, he was more concerned about the person who looked almost exactly like him. "Can you tell me more about your teacher?" He casually found a chair and sat down. Then he looked at the girl and asked, "Before that, shouldn't you introduce yourself?" The girl's inanimate eyes stared at Su Shinxing and said indifferently, as a guest of honor, "Su Shinxing." Naturally, old Su answered very frankly. He then stared at the girl's expression, but there was almost no change in her expression. There was no difference at all, as if she had never heard of this name before. "My name is Louise Reedman." Influenced by Su Shinxing's previous use of a fake name, Louise hesitated for a moment, but still reported her name. Because she had already reported it to the captain of the knights, there was no point in hiding it now. Reedman, Miss Louise, are you the survivor of the family who caused a ruckus in the West and was called blasphemers of the dead by the church? Sure enough, unlike the captain of the knights who had no reaction to this name, the mayor immediately recognized Louise's origin. Our family did not blaspheme the dead. We just want to find the mystery of death so that the living can benefit from it too. This made Louise show a nervous expression as she retorted. There was also a Church of the Pure White Church in Loma Silicon, and the girl was not confident that the mayor would not be affected by the church's public opinion. Please don't worry. I have no prejudice against necromancers. As long as they are not blinded by necromancy, necromancers are essentially no different from ordinary mages. My teacher once had a skeleton mage who specialized in necromancy as a subordinate. He had made quite a glorious contribution in the legendary era 1,000 years ago. The mayor girl said in a clear voice, Is that so? Only then did Louise relax and speak softly. But then, she realized that there seemed to be something wrong with the girl's words. Even Su Xinxing narrowed his eyes and showed a hesitant expression. The legendary era of 1,000 years ago? Oh, it seems that I've been too busy making you guys introduce yourselves. Now, let me introduce myself. The girl slowly stood up from the velvet sofa, and her petite body slowly floated up. My name is Theo Adrian, the mayor of Lomosi, the last dean of the Adrian Magic Academy, a witness of the legendary era, a survivor of the Age of Magic, and a guardian of the human civilization. She then leaped over the desk and slowly landed in front of Su Xinxing and Louise. Although you can't tell from our appearances, Sister Eliza and I are already over 1,000 years old. What an intimidating title. Unlike Louise, who was stunned by the other party, Su Xinxing didn't feel much. The girl seemed to have known this would happen and snapped her fingers lightly. The teapot and teacup with 4 legs ran to Su Xinxing and Louise like living creatures and made hot black tea for them. A cup appeared in the girl's hand out of thin air. Then, as if there was an invisible teapot pouring tea, the cup was slowly filled with amber liquid. Although it sounds a little fake, this is what I've experienced in the past. The girl who called herself Theo smiled a little forlornly. Please have some tea. Although I'm not as good as Miss Alice, who could even invite the moon goddess to the castle for a cup of tea in the legendary era, I should have improved a little in the past 1,000 years. Su Xinxing took a sip of the tea, dubiously. It was indeed delicious. It didn't have the astringent taste of ordinary black tea at all. It was smooth and fragrant. Captain Eliza sighed and complained to the city lord. Theo, didn't you say that you could leave the brewing of tea to me? It's okay. I can still do something as simple as brewing tea. After all, I'm not that close to death yet. The girl named Theo looked very cheerful, completely different from the cold feeling she gave off at the beginning. Let's talk about my teacher quickly. I'm sure Mr. Su has been waiting for a long time. Mr. Su? Shouldn't it be Mr. Xinxing or Mr. Sheng? Captain Eliza blinked her eyes and asked in confusion. Teacher once said that in his hometown, people put the first character of their surname. Theo turned her head and looked at Su Xinxing. Right, guest from another world? Well said. But compared to that, I'm more interested in the story of your teacher. Su Xinxing clapped his hands expressionlessly like Third Fatty Jean. My teacher is the greatest person in the history of this world. His name is Sylvie Adrian. He was the person who reached the true pinnacle of magic by himself 1,000 years ago. He could even come and go freely between the barriers of the world and the endless void. At the same time, he was also the person who turned the tides and saved this world time and time again. The girl said smoothly, You might not believe it, but this world had once encountered the worst calamity that could affect other worlds. It was called the Age of Destruction by my teacher. He was also the one who guided us and gathered the power of the world to finally avert that calamity. Sylvie, the Age of Destruction. If that was the case, that teacher was also himself. In other words, This world should be another world line independent of the multiverse. Just like Sylvie Avalon, who had appeared before. No wonder he was so weak this time that he could only destroy a planet. It was probably because he had projected a wisp of his consciousness into this world purely through a dream. Moreover, if you remembered correctly, Sylvie Adrian was indeed the only himself who had escaped the age of destruction that his other self had mentioned before. His other self seemed to have asked him to ask for advice on how to avoid the age of destruction. With the guidance of such a senior, it would not be impossible to minimize the effects of the age of destruction. But now, it seemed that it would not be possible to achieve it. TSK, what kind of bad joke is this? Thinking of this, Su Xinqing couldn't help but click his tongue and say in a low voice, or was he really 1,000 years late? Chapter 587. If you're so powerful, why don't you know that the crow stole your things? Louise asked curiously while Su Xinqing was still in deep thought. Because I wouldn't pay attention to such trivial matters. Theo, the silver-haired girl, wasn't angry at being questioned. She simply explained, I'm afraid you haven't paid attention to this place yet, have you? Su Xinqing said casually, coming back to his senses. You noticed? The girl smiled helplessly. A little. Su Xinqing supported his head with one hand, his expression becoming a little puzzled. Actually, I've noticed something wrong since just now. This world seems to be different from the other worlds I've been to before. Other worlds, it's said that those worlds are very vast, with almost endless places to explore, the girl said, avoiding the topic. Although there are actually some smaller worlds, but compared to this world, they are indeed vast. Since the current Su Xinqing was actually just a consciousness projected by the main body, he was much weaker than the main body in every aspect. That was why he didn't notice anything unusual at first. But this room was filled with an indescribable mysterious power, probably some kind of barrier or something similar that was used to assist the girl. In short, it was like he was hitchhiking, and that power further expanded Su Xinqing's senses. In this way, he naturally noticed the things that he didn't notice before. Just as he said, this world itself was strange. It was very narrow, and in terms of physical size, it was about the size of the solar system where Earth was located, maybe a little bigger, but not by much. The starry sky he saw at night was different from the one on Earth. Those spots of light didn't come from other stars in the universe, but from the light emitted by large amounts of heterogeneous magic stagnated in the distance. From Su Xinqing's perspective, the amount of heterogeneous magic light accumulated in each spot was comparable to the gods in the myths on Earth. But the gods in the myths and legends of a single planet were nothing when compared to the universe and the multiverse. The main body of this world was the land under Su Xinqing's feet. That's right, it wasn't even a planet. The basic shape of this world should be similar to that of China's ancient myths. The whole world was like a cake in a box, and the edge of the box was a layer of world barrier that was obviously not naturally formed. If one had to describe it, in terms of size, this world was more like a fragment of a world or something similar because it was simply too small. However, it had self-consistent and perfect laws, and the state of the world's construction was also quite stable. Whether it was according to Su Xinqing's common sense or the Space Administration's definition of the world, it could be considered a complete world. If Su Xinqing's guess was correct, Lady Theo had probably been watching the edge of the world for the past 1,000 years to prevent cracks from appearing on the world barrier. It was probably because of this that the girl, who clearly possessed the power to sweep across the world, had been holed up in this city called Lumosai, like a homebody who never left her house. When Su Xinqing told her his guess, the silver-haired girl, Theo, shook her head. Most of your guesses are correct, but there is still one thing that needs to be corrected. She stared at Su Xinqing, but the focus of her eyes was still not on Su Xinqing. My eyes did not stop at the void wall to look for cracks. Her expression became serious. I have been watching the void wall to be vigilant against the era of destruction. Didn't your teacher avoid that thing? Su Xinxing asked, a little surprised. Yes, my teacher did not solve that thing, but chose to avoid it. But avoiding also means that there is a possibility of being found again, and it is to prevent that I have been living until now. Theo nodded in response and explained the reason behind this. I see. Su Xinxing suddenly felt that the method him used to avoid the era of destruction was boring. There was a time when he wanted to escape and even lived in seclusion with his daughter for a period of time. But the result of running away was not only not solving the problem, but also killing his daughter. Since then, Su Xinxing decided that he would not continue to run away, meaninglessly. As long as there was a chance, he would use physical means to completely solve the problem from the root. Although I am not omniscient and omnipotent, I can probably understand most of the things that happen in the world. I also know the reason why you came to Luomosai this time. Theo looked at Louise, who could not understand their conversation at all, and even began to have mosquito eyes, and her expression softened a little. But because the girl had some facial paralysis, the change did not seem to be too big. Su Xinxing also made a judgment based on his experience with Emily. I will give the descendants of the Riedman family noble status. Just that alone is enough to make me grateful. Of course, Louise understood what he was saying. She was pleasantly surprised. Also, Su Xinxing, right? Theo nodded and looked at Su Xinxing again. I understand your purpose. The thing you are looking for is in the hands of a tomb raiding organization in the West called Wandering Death Knell. Tomb raiding organization. No wonder they collect that kind of thing. Su Xinxing scratched his head, but having a clue was better than searching blindly, so he accepted the invitation. No need to thank me. I also have something I want to entrust you with. Wandering Death Knell dug up something that originally belonged to Odd Eric in the Western Cliff. I hope you can bring it back to Luomosai after you deal with them. The girl paused and then said, I can give you some information that should be useful to you in exchange. Oh, such as? After hearing the story of his past in this world, Su Xinxing believed that there was nothing else in this world that was worth his attention, so he could not help but be curious about the girl's words. For example, how did the thing you are looking for enter this world? What do you think? Deal. Chapter 588. Is it really okay to tell those two about those things? After sending off Su Xinxing and Louise, Captain Eliza asked Theo, who was resting on the sofa with his eyes closed like a kitten, even if that Mr. Su looks a lot like Teacher, you can't be sure that he's the person Teacher talked about, right? Moreover, that guy's hair is completely different from Teacher's. Eliza muttered in her heart, but looking at the time, it should be around this time. Theo didn't open his eyes. He only replied in a small voice, I'm different from you, Eliza. My lifespan is about to end. The person who appears in front of me at this time must be the next savior that Teacher designated. Theo, could it be that you... I'm sorry, Eliza. I'm sure you've more or less sensed it since you're in charge of the Soul Dominion. I can't accompany you anymore. I'm really sorry, Theo continued in a soft voice. No, I'm already very satisfied that you've been with me until now. Eliza's expression softened. She walked to the floor-to-ceiling window and leaned against Theo's velvet sofa. She said softly, Really, I'm already very satisfied. It's been 1,000 years. Big Sister Sophia and Miss Alice must be waiting anxiously. No, according to Teacher's story, they might have reincarnated several times already. It's really too long. Theo seemed to be lamenting something, and his voice became ethereal. You've been looking at the void wall for 1,000 years. It's really been hard on you, Theo. Eliza lowered her head, and her voice became much lower. As long as you're still here, Adric's legacy won't end. Also, Big Sister Sharon is still at the Western Cliff, Theo murmured softly. Yes. Hey, Eliza, can you tell me how you met Teacher? Of course. At that time, I was still a girl from the countryside. Other than the trivial matters in the village, I didn't know anything about the outside world. Eliza's voice was already a little nasal, but Even so, she didn't stop. She only continued to narrate the story of the past. One day, the villagers and I saw a person with a body full of arrow porcupines lying in the wheat field. The first thing he said when he woke up was, "Are you willing to become my student?" I was stunned at the time. A satisfied smile appeared on Theo's face, and he didn't move any further, as if he had fallen into a deep sleep. Eliza, on the other hand, did not seem to notice that the girl on the sofa behind her had stopped breathing. She continued to tell the long story. The setting sun outside the window shone on the two of them through the glass, as if covering them with a layer of gorgeous light, making the whole picture look like a beautiful oil painting, beautiful and moving. Although Su Xinqing had accepted Theo's mission, he naturally couldn't leave immediately on the same day. After a few days of continuous trekking, not to mention the mortal body of Louise, even Su Xinqing felt a little tired. After all, he only had the ability of a strand of consciousness of his main body. Although Su Xinqing also rushed to the place called the Cliff of the Western Continent overnight, in the first 2 days of the journey, he generally realized that his existence in this world was completely maintained by Louise as a relay point. If he went through untold hardships to travel thousands of miles to the west, and Louise was killed here, then he would probably immediately have a network disconnect situation and directly fly back to Earth. Therefore, the two of them decided to stay in the mansion of Lil Moxie's city lord for the time being and talk about the rest tomorrow. "How are your two skeletons?" The city lord very considerately prepared 2 adjacent rooms for the two of them. Su Xinqing rested on the bed for a while before running to Louise's side. It wasn't that our main character had any improper thoughts about Louise, but because of the short nap just now, whether it was his physical or mental state, he had recovered to his peak condition. He felt that there was no point in continuing to sleep, so he decided to come over and chat with Louise. "Lola is here." The girl carefully looked at the door, then lifted the edge of the bed sheet, revealing the female skeleton hiding under the bed. Although the city lord did not seem to dislike necromancers, there was no guarantee that the other people in the castle would think the same. So Louise was still very careful. "Cooper is still waiting outside the city." "Then, what do you think about the city lord's arrangement?" Su Xinqing continued to ask. "If it's just the matter of reviving your family, it's almost half done, right?" Theo's promise was quickly fulfilled. Not long after they left the study, the knight captain of the guards sent the noble's identity certificate and the family coat of arms that was waiting for Louise to customize herself. The reason why Su Xinqing said that it was half done was because Louise was the only one left in the family, and the bloodline could easily be cut off. Therefore, expanding the family's population was also a top priority. Well, the Riedman family should have 2 branches in the Huolian Empire and the Anuit Kingdom, especially the Huolian Empire. In a sense, it's the origin of our family. Louise smiled, as if she was looking forward to the future. "After this matter is over, I'm going to go back to your hometown and get married?" Su Xinqing subconsciously finished her sentence. "Of course not. Lord Evil God, please don't make such a joke." Louise complained with dissatisfaction. "I'm just going there to take a look. If there are still branches, I'll adopt them here. If there's no problem with their conduct, it's okay to give them the position of the head of the family. Then what's the point of you working so hard to get this noble identity?" Su Xinqing could not help but ridicule. "Because it's also my father's last wish. Compared to being the head of a noble family, I'm busy with social activities all day long. In fact, I prefer to read and study the magic passed down in my family." The girl could not help but laugh. "I'm sure Mom and Dad will understand." Su Xinqing did not say anything, but he decided to help this naive girl as much as possible before he left. Chapter 589. Although Su Xinqing had long known that this world was a little strange, he did not expect it to be this strange. There's even a tree that grows bread. He carefully looked at the thing that had just been plucked from the tree. In theory, it should be some kind of fruit. But no matter how he looked at it, this thing looked like bread. It was not like the starchy fruit of the baobab tree on Earth, but the kind that was no different from ordinary bread in the true sense. This is the Rorosa fruit tree. It is said that it used to be a very ordinary fruit tree, but because of the long war between the humans and the orcs, the land became barren, and because of that there was a shortage of food. Millions of people in the entire Eastern Plains faced famine. The legendary hero who witnessed all of this transformed this fruit tree with magic and made it grow bread that could be eaten directly. Louise explained to Su Xinxing as if she was familiar with the tree. But in order to prevent the ecosystem from being affected by the Rorosa fruit tree, the hero set a limit. First of all, the number of this fruit tree can only be kept constant. It can be less, but it can never be more. Then this fruit tree can only grow in the area near the western cliff of Timothy. Finally, this fruit tree rots very quickly after leaving the branch. Thanks to its unique ecology, even the kings of some small countries in the east have never tasted this magical fruit. Hearing what she said, Su Xinxing also gave up the idea of bringing this thing back to Mo Li to taste. Although the little girl might really be able to grow this thing on Earth, the person who created this plant must have thought long and hard before setting such a serious condition. It was better for him not to mess around blindly. After all, many things from this world were likely to have strange mutations when transplanted to other worlds, although he had not experienced it himself. But when he chatted with Lux in the Space Administration, she mentioned that there was once a deacon who had a mild illness similar to a cold. Because he insisted on working with the illness, he went to another world and brought the virus with him. In the end, the virus mutated into a terrible zombie virus in the new world, and directly destroyed a civilization that had developed close to the interstellar era in the New World. The legendary hero you are talking about, could it be the teacher of the Lord of Lumosai? So, he wisely changed the topic. I'm not sure about that either. After all, it's been nearly 1,000 years since the legendary era. Very few documents from that time have been preserved until now. Louise smiled bitterly. To be honest, I felt like I was dreaming when I met those two people who had lived since the Age of Legends. I see. Su Xinxing didn't say anything more. He just took a big bite of the thing called rosa fruit, which was almost the same as bread. Even the texture of this thing was no different from bread, but there was more of a fruity sweetness in the taste. After filling their stomachs for a while, they continued their journey towards the western cliff. Did you find it? In a small town near the western cliff, there was a rather hidden underground tavern. At this moment, in the corner of this tavern, there were two men wrapped in black attire who were engaged in some kind of transaction. The slightly shorter and fatter one asked the other in a slightly impatient tone. Of course, those idiots Reedmen probably never thought that the poor people under their rule would rebel. Apart from the research notes that the girl took away during the chaos, the other things have already been exchanged with the rebel leaders for some small benefits. The tall man seemed to be very proud of this. Even the Reedman family's legendary treasure, Olavia's skull, wasn't left behind. Those who don't know a single word are considered lowly. They don't understand the value of these things. Can you understand the Reedman family's necromancy without the research notes? The short man seemed to be skeptical. He picked up the wine bottle on the side and poured half a cup of strong liquor into the tall man's cup. Also, are you sure those forces won't notice us? Although we lack some of the latest research results, fortunately, the basic technology is recorded in other seized documents. If we let the necromancers in the association study it, it shouldn't be too difficult to accomplish our goal. The tall man took a sip of the strong liquor in front of him and then let out a long sigh. Moreover, we didn't show up from the beginning to the end of the Reedman family's rebellion. No one should have noticed our existence. Those fools in the King's Council are probably still arguing over who should take the blame. That's good. The short man seemed relieved. Compared to my side, how was the result on your side? Then the tall man asked. It's not that easy. After all, it's much more difficult to steal that thing under the eyes of the Queen of the West, Shalania Katarina Kealicado, compared to you inciting those commoners to rebel against the honest Reedman family. The short man shook his head, his voice sounding a bit awkward. After a moment of silence, the short man suddenly asked, "By the way, since we've seized Aravia's skull, can't we just use it to summon the evil god Auravia? To be honest, the risk on our side is a bit too high. After all, the Queen of the West is a vampire who has lived for more than 1,000 years. She's not even afraid of sunlight. If there's even the slightest mistake, we might be uprooted by her." After saying that, the short man seemed to have thought of something, and his whole body trembled. Then he probably felt ashamed of his cowardice, so he took a big gulp of strong liquor and ended up choking and coughing. Unfortunately, it's impossible to summon the evil god, Auravia. The Reedman family has had Aravia's skull for many years. They must have secretly tried to summon that lord, but from the seized documents, there were no successful examples. Occasionally, they could trade with the evil god, but the things they got from the trade were nothing special. The tall man shook his head, and with the loss of magic power in this world, I'm afraid that the longer we delay, the lower the chances of success. Our hope for revival can only be pinned on that you found the hero of the legendary era, who completely destroyed our Red Lotus Church 1,000 years ago, Seve Adrian's grave. Chapter 590. So this is the destination? At first, Su Xinxing had been influenced by the local tomb-robbing dramas, so much so that he thought the place the city lord had instructed them to go to was definitely a relatively remote place, even if it wasn't the wilderness. But in truth, this place called Western Continent Town was fairly flourishing. That's because the Western Continent Cliff originally didn't have too many resources. But several years ago, an exploration team from the east discovered an astonishing amount of Ilum veins on the Windy Plateau. Add to that the special stone materials of the Windy Plateau itself have many uses. This area gradually prospered as the veins were mined. As a noble, Louise, who had more information channels than commoners, naturally knew about the situation in this area. She told Su Xinxing what she knew about this area. So that's how it is. But this makes things a bit troublesome. If this place was as desolate as Su Xinxing had thought, finding a few people wouldn't be too troublesome. But it was much more difficult to find the culprit in this situation. He didn't even know which way to go. Is there no way to find the way automatically? This isn't good. Just as Su Xinxing was feeling vexed over this matter, Louise came up with an idea. Why don't we go directly to the leader of the Timothy Empire and ask for her help? She suggested to Su Xinxing, if we use the name of the neutral city of Luomosai, they might help us. I don't have any other ideas. Anyway, let's do as you say. Su Xinxing naturally wasn't unreasonable and immediately decided to use the young lady's method. Although they could have gone directly to the Western Continent Town's mayor, there was an 80% chance that the other party had no clue about the so-called tomb robbers. Or, rather, if it was a group of tomb robbers that could be dealt with by a mere mayor, there was no need for the governor of Luomoxi to entrust this matter to Su Xinxing. The leader of Timosine, the queen of the western region, Shalania Katerina K. Alicado, lives in the suspended palace on the western cliff, Roland explained to Su Xinxing as he pointed at the cliff in the distance that looked like a huge wall between heaven and earth. It's a building that was left behind from a legendary era and built with materials that can only be produced in the abyss. That's why it can stand for so many years without collapsing. In addition, some people say that the queen of the western region, Shalania Katerina K. Alicado, is also an ancient who has lived since the legendary era. In fact, I used to think that this was just a rumor, but after meeting the Lord of Luomosai, I feel that this ridiculous saying might actually be true. Louise smiled embarrassedly. If that's the case, then the princess of the western region with a very long name should know the city lord of Luomoshi. Maybe she can really help us. Su Xinxing listened to the girl's words and couldn't help but nod his head. But the problem now is how to go up to the suspended palace. The queen of the western region, Shalania Katerina K. Alicado, and her servants are all vampires, so they basically fly up. It's not easy for ordinary people to go up. Even the steam gliders produced by the Steam Chamber of Commerce can easily crash into the cliff and self-destruct. When it came to business, the girl couldn't help but frown as she became distressed. Leave this to me. Su Shinxing confidently took care of everything. Louise naturally didn't doubt this Lord Evil God, and peacefully left the matter of how to go up the mountain to Su Shinxing. Thus, after the two finished their lunch in the western town, they continued to rush to the bottom of the western cliff. As the saying goes, if you look at a mountain, it will kill a horse. Although looking at the majestic western cliff from the western town, it actually took the two nearly 4 hours to reach the western cliff at a normal speed of about 40 kilometers per hour after renting a carriage. After temporarily parking the carriage in a quarry under the western cliff, the two began to look for the location of the suspended palace. The cliffs here are bare. No matter how I look at it, it doesn't look like there's a palace hidden here. Or, rather, when we rushed here from Western Town, I found it strange because I couldn't see the floating palace you mentioned at all. After searching for half a day, Su Shinxing couldn't help but feel a little strange. Even if his strength decreased, the characteristics he possessed would not disappear. Whether it was camouflage or illusion, they were ineffective against Su Shinxing. On the contrary, things like optical camouflage that didn't affect him were a little effective against him. In theory, if something like optical camouflage was used on something too large like a palace, then even Su Shinxing should be able to vaguely see the outline of the object. Yes, I'm not too sure about the specifics, but the original owner of the suspended palace was also a vampire, so it only appears at night. Louise racked her brains to recall her pitiful knowledge of the suspended palace on the western cliff. Su Shinxing looked up and found that although most of the sky was blocked by the cliff, the exposed part was just dyed a little red. It was probably dusk now. In other words, we have to wait here for a few more hours? Louise hurriedly nodded. Just as Su Shinxing helplessly sighed and planned to find a place to take a dump, the sound of flapping wings came from above them. It's a nightstick. Louise cried out in surprise like an ordinary little girl. A nightstick? Could it be that the creator of this world was also a fanatical Harry Potter fan? With such doubts, Su Shinxing looked up and saw two creatures that looked like bats that were magnified 10 times over descending from the sky. Chapter 591. Two large bats. Yi Qi brought Su Shinxing's carriage and crashed into the mountain wall. Su Shinxing, who had been tested for a long time, didn't feel anything at all. First of all, he had a rough idea of how this thing worked. If this mountain rock wasn't made of some kind of material that was between real and illusory, then these large bats had a rune or a key that could pass through the mountain rock. In any case, with Su Shinxing's physique that could ignore all illusions, only these two, or similar, might be able to fool his eyes. Second of all, even though he was in a weakened state, he still had the combat power of a planet, let alone a mountain rock. Even if he crashed into lava, he could guarantee that nothing would happen to him. The girl next to him wasn't so calm. Louise hugged Su Shinxing's arm and closed her eyes in fear, like a timid girl about to ride a screaming ride. It was fine, because Su Shinxing's body was good. But if it was an ordinary person, his arm would probably be bruised by now. The moment they crashed into the mountain wall, Su Shinxing felt like he crashed into a big soap bubble. He only felt a slight obstruction, then everything in front of him suddenly became clear. Even though he didn't know how wide the so-called wind gap plateau was, judging from the size of this cave, it wasn't an exaggeration to say that it hollowed out a mountain. Almost all of the rock walls were inlaid with strange, sparkling crystals. If it weren't for the fact that the radiation from these things might hurt little Chiketsu, Su Shinxing would have broken off some of them and brought them back as gifts. The bottom of the cave was flowing lava. From time to time, lava would spurt out from the ground like fountains. The highest was more than 10 meters high. However, the most eye-catching thing in the entire cave was the creation in the middle. Because it was in the middle of a bright lava lake, if one didn't look at its appearance, it would look like there was a small mountain in the middle of a mountain. But if one looked closely, they would find that it was a huge building. There were countless towers and palaces on it, but they were connected to each other and became a single entity. That's right, it wasn't a building complex, but a single mountain-like building like a castle hundreds of meters high. This is Louise Swallowed, the palace of the Queen of the West. This is the first time I've seen such a building. Oh. Su Xinxing's expression was much more indifferent. This building was indeed quite amazing. If it was placed on Earth, it would definitely be another wonder, the kind that could beat the other 8 wonders of the world. But if it was based on the foundation of Earth or a similar world, in terms of size, Su Xinxing's experience, a cottage in the Great Devil's world, could probably beat this thing. Why do I feel like this thing is more like a place for dwarves than a vampire's castle? After carefully looking at it for a moment, Su Xinxing commented, because the level of technology in many fantasy worlds was not high when it came to steel production or forging weapons and equipment, the natural heat source of lava was very convenient for the dwarf race with rough skin. Therefore, even in different fantasy worlds, the dwarves who liked to forge would basically gather in places with lava that was not as dangerous as volcanoes. Is that so? Louise tilted her head doubtfully. Are there no dwarves in your world? Su Xinxing couldn't help but ask curiously. After all, this world also looked like a standard fantasy world. According to the world's information diffraction and mimetic phenomena, the probability of the birth of a dwarf race should be quite high. According to the legend of our creation, the dwarf race was among the original 8 races at the beginning. In fact, many documents handed down from ancient times also recorded that until the legendary era, there was still a small number of dwarves who could communicate with humans. But after the end of the legendary era, these dwarves all disappeared. Some scholars think that they went extinct because they couldn't adapt to the changes in the world. Louise explained to Su Xinxing, when a faceless man wearing a classical suit appeared in front of Su Xinxing and the others and welcomed them into the magnificent castle, Su Xinxing couldn't help but frown. Although she kept looking around because she was curious about the surrounding environment, Louise immediately noticed the change in Su Xinxing's expression and couldn't help but ask him in a low voice what he found. This building is not a product of this world. Su Xinxing carefully looked around and then answered affirmatively. Right, in that case, I once heard that Timothy used to be a territory occupied by the Dark Alliance formed by abyssal creatures, but after the end of the legendary era, it returned to human management. Could it be that this castle is a creation of the abyss? The startled Louise hurriedly and carefully looked at the furnishings around her, fearing that the full set of plate armor not far away would suddenly move or something. No, that's not what I meant. Su Xinxing felt a headache coming on. For the people of this world, the abyss was already a different world. But for Su Xinxing, the so-called abyss was actually just some subsidiary space of this world, just like the relationship between the present world of Earth and the Netherworld. But this building was even more different, and it could even be said that it was fundamentally different. Unfortunately, although Su Xinxing had a wealth of knowledge and experience, his own knowledge was not profound, so there was no way to distinguish where this castle came from. Ah! Louise suddenly made a sound of surprise. What's wrong? Su Xinxing was startled by her sudden change in attitude. I know the ancient characters on the wall over there. Louise looked at the patterns on the wall not far away, in surprise. That's not just, huh? Originally, because Su Xinxing thought that it was just a pattern, he didn't notice it, but when he focused on the pattern, his protection worked. Edric? He tried to read it. It has the same surname as the city lord of Luomosai and the head of the guards. Louise continued, if that's the case, could this castle be? With her reminder, Su Xinxing also remembered. That's right, this castle is the 5th academy of Edric Academy from 1,000 years ago. At this time, a crisp and sweet voice sounded from the edge of the corridor. Su Xinxing and the others looked toward the sound, but saw a beautiful girl with a hot body. She was wearing a red muslin dress and was leisurely walking toward them. I have already heard the general situation from Alyssa and the others, guests from another world. So first, let me introduce myself. I am the Queen of the West you are looking for, Shalania Katarina K. Alicado, the current owner of this castle. Chapter 592. Hello, hello. Because it was the first time she had seen the legendary figure, Louise looked excited. I am Louise Reedman, but the Queen of the West's eyes only stayed on her for a moment and then turned to Su Xinxing. They really look alike. I didn't expect to see that bastard's face again in this life. The image of the Queen of the West, who was originally full of majesty, turned into an ordinary girl as she spoke through gritted teeth. Do you have any grudges with that Adrian's ancestor? Su Xinxing racked his brains, but still couldn't think of how to address himself from 1,000 years ago in this world. In the end, he could only use a more subtle word to refer to him. That bastard said something about reproductive isolation, so he wouldn't marry me. Later, he said something about wanting to spend the rest of his life as a human. He actually left me and passed away. A legendary mage obviously has other ways to prolong his life. Not sure if it was Su Xinxing's appearance that evoked her memories, but the Queen of the West spoke faster and faster, and her voice became more and more bitter. Well, it seems that Senior owes a lot of love debts. Su Xinxing lowered his head and didn't dare to say a word, for fear that the other party's anger would burn his head. If there's anything that Su Xinxing was more afraid of besides seafood, it was probably the so-called love debts. So many times Su Xinxing actually understood in his heart, but he would pretend to be a blockhead. Love debts were the most difficult thing to repay in all worlds. Don't ask him how he knew. Fortunately, the Queen of the West's mind was still clear. Even after 1,000 years, there were no signs of dementia, and she quickly adjusted her mood. Sorry, I let you see my undignified side. She took a deep breath and returned to the majestic state she had when they first met. It was just that both Su Xinxing and Louise could no longer be in awe of this girl. It's okay. So, about our mission? Su Xinxing immediately and considerately changed the topic. Let's talk as we walk. I've already asked the maids to prepare dinner. The Queen of the Western region curled up her lips into an elegant smile. Then she reluctantly withdrew her gaze from Su Xinxing's face, turned around, and walked away. Su Xinxing glanced at Louise and found that she was in a state of confusion. He could only sigh and follow the girl. For some reason, Su Xinxing began to miss Amoli, who would raise his hands high and cheer for dinner. As I've told you, this is Academy Block 5 of the Adrian Magic Academy, the place where Shi-Wei Adrian faced off against the Age of Destruction. On the way, the Princess of the Western region talked to herself as they walked. When Su Xinxing heard her, he couldn't help but be taken aback. But I heard that Adrian, his ancestor, avoided the Age of Destruction. Yes, although I'm not too sure about the actual situation. According to Shi-Wei, if he wanted to avoid the Age of Destruction, he would have to face it. The Princess of the Western region nodded. Her words surprised Su Xinxing. To tell the truth, he had been rather disdainful of the Shi-Wei Adrian of 1,000 years ago in this world. Compared to the Shi-Wei Avalon who had faced the Age of Destruction head-on, this Shi-Wei Adrian of 1,000 years ago was too reliant on luck, even if his method of escape worked for a while. Perhaps he chose to die, because he was afraid that he would face the end of the world. But now, the Queen of the Western region's words made Su Xinxing see another side. Shi-Wei Adrian didn't choose to run away without doing anything. Instead, he faced off against the Age of Destruction and personally witnessed the strength of the enemy and made such a decision after making a rational judgment. Although it was a bit of a consequence theory, his choice did allow this world to survive for over 1,000 years. Perhaps he should reconsider the actions of this senior. As a base to face off against the Age of Destruction, this academy actually had a corresponding district, but it was almost completely destroyed in the battle. The princess of the Western region, who didn't know Su Xinxing's thoughts, continued the conversation. After that, the human forces led by Shi Wei purged the territories occupied by the Dark Coalition of Timothine, which was the abyssal creatures. After that, Shi Wei gave me Academy Block 5 so that I could use it to house the abyssal creatures that could coexist peacefully with humans. The ruins of the district where Academy Block 5 was originally located were turned into a cemetery for the warriors who died in the several battles. At this point, the princess of the Western region paused for a moment before continuing. Later on, there were his own bones. The deans of Adrian Academy were also buried there. And this practice continued until the loss of mana in the world forced Adrian Academy to close down. Could it be that the purpose of our visit this time is that cemetery? Su Xinxing more or less understood what she meant and continued the conversation. That's right. Although the cemetery is guarded by the abyssal creatures under my command, it's actually the same size as some large cities, so it's unrealistic to want to guard every place. Moreover, there haven't been any accidents in the last 1,000 years, so they relaxed. But some time ago, when I went to visit Shi Wei's grave, I found some abnormalities. The graves of the deans of Adrian Academy were burglarized. Although her tone didn't change much, both Su Xinxing and Louise felt a chill run down their spines. In fact, if there was a thermometer around, they would find that the temperature had indeed dropped by several degrees. It seems that, although the princess of the Western region cursed Su Xinxing Sr. as a bastard, her feelings for him were quite deep. That's why your goal is to capture those grave robbers. If possible, take back everything that belongs to Audiobook Academy that they stole. Then, she said what Su Xinxing expected. Wouldn't it be better to leave it to the police or detectives? Although Su Xinxing muttered to himself, he didn't have any objections. And from a certain point of view, if he allowed them to do as they pleased, those grave robbers might end up robbing him instead. Although there would be differences because of the difference in the world, and this him was not him, it still made Su Xinxing very unhappy. Don't worry, it's fine. And so he readily agreed to the mission. Chapter 593. After resting for a night in the palace of the Queen of the West, Su Xinxing and the others were ready to set off. May I ask, why are you here? But there seemed to be an extra person in the carriage. This made Su Xinxing cover his forehead and ask helplessly, "Don't mind it, it's just that I haven't visited that guy's grave for a while, so this time I'm taking you there." There it was, a standard Sundra scene. Su Xinxing criticized in his heart, "I always feel that you're thinking of something very impolite." The Queen of the West narrowed her wine-red eyes and stared at Su Xinxing. For some reason, the latter felt pressured. No, it's just that for a queen to sit in a small broken carriage like ours, don't you think it's undignified? Only those who are lowly in their bones would value something like dignity. The other party just answered casually, and then, as if she was no longer interested in Su Xinxing, she turned her head and looked out the window at the scenery she should have been tired of. They were silent all the way. Even Louise, who was originally very excited, was worried about the queen. So she became silent. Su Xinxing was also the kind of person who didn't like to talk much except to acquaintances, because once he spoke, it would be easy to expose his true nature of being a clown. Today's carriage was not pulled by horses, but by the big bats called night unicorns from yesterday. Interestingly, when they folded their wings, they looked like a combination of a monkey and a fox with a very strange appearance and color. Although, at first, Su Xinxing had doubts about whether this kind of thing could really run fast. In fact, this strange creature ran quite fast. Because old Su was used to his own speed, he didn't feel much about other speeds, because in his view they were all extremely slow, but just from the way the scenery outside the window retreated, it was probably comparable to the speed of a high-speed train. About half an hour later, they arrived at their destination. Oh, what a surprise! Su Xinxing opened the curtain in front of the carriage, looked at the scene in front of him, and couldn't help but let out a surprised sound. It's actually like this due to the influence of television and movies. He originally thought that this kind of cemetery was not like the ancient mausoleums of the Celestial Dynasty, but like the vast grassland with many tombs erected in foreign movies. In the end, what appeared before them was a bottomless pit. Even with Su Xinxing's eyesight, he couldn't see anything when he looked down. This place was originally the world's guide, the location of the world axis. In the war against the Age of Destruction, Shi Wei had extracted the world axis and forged it into the most powerful weapon against the Age of Destruction. Therefore, there's nothing down here. It's the closest place to the concept of nothing in this world. As if she already knew that Su Xinxing would be surprised by this, the Queen of the Western region explained, "And the floating island in the middle is the location of Adrian's cemetery. How should I put it? It's really surprising." Looking at the floating island, he muttered to himself. It wasn't that he hadn't seen a floating island before, but the way the floating island was connected to the outside world surprised him. There were 6 huge rainbow-colored bridges made up of countless dazzling petals. The beautiful petals at the edge of the bridges poured down into the bottomless abyss like a waterfall. It was a spectacular sight with a different kind of beauty. It's the apologetic flower. Legend has it that if you find a flower with 6 petals, you can communicate with the dead. Louise whispered to Su Xinxing, "Where did these petals come from?" Su Xinxing asked curiously. "It's a concept. The apologetic flower itself is a miracle brought about by Shi Wei, a symbol of the living's remembrance and remembrance of the dead. Every time apologetic flower blooms in this world, another flower's petal will appear here. Before it falls to the bottom of the world and becomes nothing, these petals will be accepted by the world itself, and then new apologetic flowers will bloom in other parts of the world." The Queen of the Western region answered. She paused for a moment before continuing, "If one day the people of this world no longer have nostalgia for the dead, the apologetic flower will disappear. This cemetery will also sink to the bottom of the world and become a part of nothing. In other words, as long as people are afraid of death and still have memories of the dead, this cemetery will exist forever?" Su Xinxing couldn't help but ask curiously, "I'm afraid that there is nothing eternal in this world. Even the legendary archmages who are closest to the vortex of chaos can't resist the passage of time and the pride of humans who don't want to become abnormal." The Queen of the Western region's voice became a little lower. She was probably talking about the choice of the me in this world. Su Xinxing thought to himself, "From here on out, we can't take a car. Let's go down and prepare to walk." Then, under the leadership of the Queen of the Western region, the 3 slowly crossed the bridge made of apologetic flower petals and arrived at the city gate. At the moment, the gate was guarded by a humanoid creature that was about 3 meters tall and had muscles that didn't look like a human at all. "Greetings, Your Majesty the Queen." The humanoid creature used a voice as rough as its appearance to greet the Queen of the Western region. "You may rise. Did anything unusual happen here?" The Queen of the Western region waved her hand and asked. "Nothing unusual for the time being, but 2 rare guests have come." The other party replied, "Oh, who dares to come here?" The Queen of the Western region suddenly became a little interested. "Why do you make it sound like it's scary?" Su Xinxing whispered behind her. "Because this place is called the closest place to the soul territory, and many of the guards here are undead creatures. Therefore, on the human side, Adrian Cemetery is one of the 3 most dangerous places, along with the Cave of Grief and the Amber Cave, which have extremely high mortality rates." Louise explained to Su Xinxing, "That's your human prejudice. Humans are like this. They will be vigilant and suspicious of other species, so they are not welcomed by other species." Unexpectedly, the Queen of the Western region heard the 2 whispering and immediately snorted, expressing her disdain. "Your Majesty the Queen?" The huge humanoid creature seemed a little confused. "It's okay. I'm not talking to you. You continue to report." "Okay." The other party nodded its head that was slightly bigger than a pumpkin. "The visitor is the saintess of the Pure White Church, Lady Aurelia, and her attendant, the new sacred silver swordswoman Anelita. A troublesome fellow has come. The queen of the western region frowned, which was rare. Pure white church? Saintess? Unlike the surprised Louise, Su Xinxing showed a puzzled expression. I guess that fellow is also here to visit Shi Wei's grave. Well, I'm a little interested to see what expression she will make when she sees you. Let's go. In just a moment, the queen of the western region showed a smirk and said with a rather wicked tone, "Could it be that the saintess was also an old acquaintance of this world? How promiscuous was he in this world?" Chapter 594. Not long after arriving at the floating island of the cemetery, Su Xinxing and the others saw the adoratress and her attendant that the giant guard had mentioned. Every time, I thought that the next time we meet would be when you lead the church's army to attack the western region. I never thought that it would never happen. The queen of the western region sighed and looked at the adoratress not far away. With all due respect, Su Xinxing carefully looked at the so-called adoratress for a long time and found that he was not confused by illusions or the like. He then asked the queen of the western region, "Why does the adoratress look like a baby?" It might be a little too much to call her a baby, but from her appearance, she was indeed no more than 3 years old. It would not be a problem to call her a young girl. But what the queen of the western region said just now sounded like she was talking to an old acquaintance who was both a friend and a foe. This strange contrast made Su Xinxing a little confused. Or is that girl who looks like an unmarried mother holding a baby the adoratress you mentioned? Rude. How rude is this? Before the queen of the western region could speak, the girl holding the little girl had already blushed and scolded loudly. "I am the chief attendant of the adoratress, the sword princess Anirita, who has inherited the name of Holy Silver." The girl, with short, chestnut-colored hair, first sternly cleared her name of being an unmarried mother, then she raised the little girl in her hand and said, "This is the Holy Spirit who can guide the future of light and hope for mankind. The Holy Spirit who has been the benchmark of the pure white church since the legendary era, Lady Irelia." She had been alive since the legendary era? Then she was about 1,000 years old? Su Xinxing suddenly looked at the little girl in shock. "Anirita, put me down, I'm a little dizzy." The adoratress, who was unconsciously raised high by her attendant, made a weak protest. I'm sorry." The girl, with short, chestnut-colored hair, immediately came back to her senses and put the future of mankind in her hands, the benchmark of the church back in place. That saintess is indeed someone from the same era as me. However, her existence is somewhat special. Things like age cannot leave any traces on her body. Her appearance is related to her current state. The queen of the western region casually explained to Su Xinxing, "From the looks of it, I'm afraid she just lost a lot of blood not long ago. Could it be that her period is bleeding?" Su Xinxing replied without rhyme or reason. As a result, all the girls present rolled their eyes at him. This appearance looks like Mr. Shi's prophecy came true. The saintess, who was in the arms of the girl with short, chestnut-colored hair, stared straight at Su Xinxing. Although I already knew the content of the prophecy, the degree of similarity is still surprising. "Oh, so you know about that prophecy, too?" As a result, the queen of the western region, who had been looking forward to seeing the strange expression of the saintess, suddenly showed a bored expression. After all, in this world, the only ones who can survive until the day the prophecy comes true are you and me, the immortals. It's understandable that he would tell me, isn't it? The baby-sized saintess said these words in a rather mature tone, which made Su Xinxing feel very uncomfortable. Then, Su Xinxing suddenly noticed that Louise, who had always been talkative, seemed to have stopped talking. He looked at the girl strangely. "What's wrong?" "Nothing, I'm just a little nervous." The girl replied in a small voice. Su Xinxing suddenly realized, come to think of it, this girl was a necromancer. Although the mayor of Luomosai and the queen of the western region did not care about her identity, The one in front of them was now recognized by the Queen of the Western region as a true saintess of the church. Moreover, she was of the highest rank. Even with Su Xinxing's shallow knowledge of this world, he knew that the religion with the largest number of believers was the pure white church. Because of this, it was natural that Louise would feel nervous in front of them. "So, what is the purpose of your visit this time?" The Queen of the Western region asked the two visitors from the pure white church. It was probably after they had finished their reminiscing that the Queen of the Western region regained her regal bearing. The cemetery of martyrs that the pure white church had sealed off for almost 100 years had been raided. Many of the corpses were missing, and although we caught a few of the raiders, they seemed to have been brainwashed. Their words were all jumbled up and illogical. The saintess had also entered a businesslike state, although it made Su Xinxing feel even more out of place. In the end, we only managed to find out that the mastermind seemed to need powerful corpses when they were alive. "I see. I think I understand now." The Queen of the Western region nodded, her wine-red eyes showing a hint of coldness. From Su Xinxing's point of view, the raiders who raided the cemetery of martyrs of the pure white church were in cahoots with those who raided Adrian's cemetery. And when it came to powerful corpses when they were alive, Adrian, who had saved the world 1,000 years ago, was naturally the best candidate. Obviously, the people of the pure white church had also thought of this, which was why they came here to see if they could catch the mastermind. But unfortunately, you've come too late. I've already put a lot of people in this cemetery to patrol and guard it. There are even undead dragons and black merit knights. If those criminals are still in their right minds, I'm afraid they won't come here again," the Queen of the Western region said proudly. Then, in the next moment, there was a violent explosion at the cemetery not far away. Su Xinxing and the saintess looked at the Queen of the Western region at the same time, who had been bragging just a moment ago. The latter was stunned for a moment, and then she was embarrassed and angry at being slapped in the face. It seems that the undead dragons and black merit knights can't stop those people. The saintess mocked. "It's fine." The Queen of the Western region took a deep breath, and her eyes were cold. There's still the vampire queen. As soon as she finished speaking, she turned into countless bats that blotted out the sky and flew towards the site of the explosion. "Annie, let's go too." "Yes, saintess." Then the unmarried mother carrying the baby also quickly left. Lord Evil God, seeing the two members of the pure white church leave, Louise finally breathed a sigh of relief and looked at Su Xinxing, only to find that the latter's expression wasn't very good. Because this world wasn't spherical, people's vision was much wider than on Earth. And with Su Xinxing's eyesight, he could actually see where the explosion was. It was a huge diamond-shaped crystal prism with a line of words from this world engraved on it. To the ancestor of our Dean, the great man, Shiwei Adrian, who lies here in eternal rest. Chapter 595. Following the second explosion, the huge crystal monument slowly tilted from its floating state before crashing into the ground and breaking in two. The bats that blotted out the sky let out ear-piercing screeches, and the scene was as frightening as the end of the world. However, the grave robbers seemed to have been prepared to disturb the vampire queen. Unbeknownst to them, they had set up several huge rapid-fire crossbows around the cemetery, and in the span of a few breaths, countless bolts were shot into the sky. The bats that were caught off guard were hit by the bolts, and for a moment they fell to the ground like rain. But if that was all it took to kill the Queen of the West, the vampire elder would not have lived for 1,000 years. The bats turned into a dark, eerie cloud, and a huge palm reached out from the cloud, smashing the rapid-fire crossbows into pieces. The bolts from the rapid-fire crossbows could not even penetrate the skin of the huge palm. Seeing this, the grave robbers began to throw out fist-sized red crystals in an orderly manner. Those were Ilum crystals that had been nitrified and only needed a little mana as a catalyst to activate them into an unstable state that could easily explode. Sure enough, after a series of explosions, The edge of the black cloud was shaved off, and the huge palm vaporized and disappeared. The human form of the Queen of the West then appeared in the last of the black cloud. "It seems that I have underestimated you." She frowned. Though the bat's damage was neither painful nor ticklish, it was definitely a wound. A fire element Ilum crystal with holy light magic. "So that's why you attacked the Pure White Church." If it was just fire elemental Ilum crystals, it would not be a problem for the Vampire Queen. But if it was mixed with holy light magic as an explosive agent, it would be a different story. Moreover, she had confirmed from the sky that half of Seve Adrian's grave had been dug up, and the corpses of the soldiers patrolling the cemetery were also lying near the grave. It seemed that they had been murdered. As the Queen of the West returned to her original form, the grave robbers cheered excitedly, probably thinking that victory was in their hands. "You lawless grave robbers, accept the punishment of the holy light." In the next moment, Anita, who was carrying the Saintess, had arrived, and with a swing of her sword, she killed a few of the grave robbers who had poked their heads out. And so, she showed a mocking smile at the Vampire Queen. The latter was already quite upset that the grave robbers looked down on her, and this added fuel to the fire. The Vampire Queen snorted, and with a wave of her small hand, dark red blood flashed endlessly. Every time this light appeared, the blood of a grave robber's body would be sucked dry. By the time Su, Xinxing, and the rest had arrived, the grave robbers of the grave robbers, and distorted, and the voice, but the voice, although the voice was roaring, the voice, "It's our family spell," but most of it seems to have been tampered with by them. They deliberately used more dangerous and radical spells in many places. Louise immediately recognized what the other party was yelling about. At the same time, Su Xinxing felt something was wrong almost at the same time when the other party raised the thing in his hand. It was a strange feeling of familiarity. He originally thought that the feeling came from the tomb of the other him, but now it seemed that was not the case. The thing in the other party's hand was a skull. Almost in a flash, Su Xinxing had already determined that the thing was the purpose of his trip, his former head. It seemed that the short and fat guy was forced into a dead end, so this guy took out his head and wanted to use the spell to summon the evil god to see if there was a way to survive. The problem was that now that Su Xinxing was here, this guy who was forced into a corner would not be able to summon anything. That was what Su Xinxing thought at first, but that was not the case. As the short and fat guy chanted, a black fog that did not exist in this world appeared behind him as if it was made of pure malice and filth. The evil was so strong that the Saintess let out a sorrowful cry when it came to this world. Her sacred blood began to boil in her body. "I actually worked. All of you. Tremble before the evil god, Oravaya. It's an anomaly that surpasses the 7 great demon kings of the mythological era, the most powerful in this world." The short and fat guy laughed maniacally. "If I knew that I could summon Oravaya, I wouldn't have needed Shiwei, Adrian." In the next moment, he was sucked into the black fog. Chewing sounds and screams could be heard, and then he gradually stopped breathing. TSK, the evil god Oravaya actually exists. The Vampire Queen could not help muttering regretfully as she glanced at the Saintess, who was still moaning. "What should we do now?" Anelita, who had short chestnut-colored hair, panicked at once. On the other side, after devouring all the grave robbers, the black fog had already set its sights on them. It seemed to have nurtured some kind of humanoid entity within its body. With just a light step, it appeared in front of everyone and reached out its hand to grab the Saintess and Anita. It seemed that the holy light magic on the two of them disgusted it. Almost at that moment, Su Xinxing had already appeared in front of the Saintess and Anelita. He punched the arm of the black fog with his right hand. The moment the two fists collided, a terrifying power erupted from within. Anelita was blown dozens of meters away by the violent force. The ground could not withstand the shockwave and immediately caved in like the bottom of a pot. Even Louise, who was dozens of meters away, was blown away. Only the Vampire Queen was able to stand firm, and was not blown away, by the shockwave. "What the hell are you?" Su Shinxing asked the saintess, but of course he did not get any answer. At that moment, Louise cried out in surprise, "Adrian's grave!" The others took the time to look in that direction, only to see the tomb of the great man, Seymour Adric, crumbling. But the tomb was empty. It was an empty grave. Chapter 596. How is this possible? Why is Sylvie's grave empty? Even in the face of a powerful enemy, the Queen of the Western region could not help but exclaim, "I saw him being buried with my own eyes." On the other hand, Su Shinxing had no time to pay attention to the fact that his grave was empty in this world. He originally thought that even if his strength had declined greatly, he should still be an invincible existence in this distorted small world. But in reality, that was not the case. At least, the strange being shrouded in black fog summoned by the short and fat grave robber using Su Shinxing's skull was on par with him now. It was not that the opponent was strong. In terms of combat skills, the person in the black fog could be considered a very good warrior. But in Su Shinxing's view, the opponent was more like a berserker who had no rationality. It was purely based on a sea of combat experience that had deeply engraved countless combat skills into its bones and turned them into its own instincts. Su Shinxing had long stopped using this kind of combat style in the Lattice world. Thus, even though the black fog could block Su Shinxing's perception, and he couldn't even see the other party's appearance, he was able to get a general idea of the other party's size and fighting style in just the blink of an eye. The biggest problem for Su Shinxing was that his attacks could not effectively cause damage to the opponent. His fist that could shatter mountains hit the opponent's body, but it was like a stone sinking into the sea. His kick that could crush the earth was like stepping on a sponge. There was no tangible feedback. But the physical phenomenon on the outside proved that the opponent had a physical body. Otherwise, the destructive power of Su Shinxing's fist at the beginning would have been enough to destroy the entire floating island, and not just a big crater on the ground. "Girl over there, quickly take your saintess away from here. Otherwise, she might have to die here." After putting some distance between himself and the black fog, Su Shinxing took the time to shout to the girl, with short, chestnut-colored hair named Anelita, "And Louise, you should leave as well. I probably won't be able to take care of you in the upcoming battle." The girl, who was frightened by the battle between him and the black fog, immediately came back to her senses. She carried the still moaning saintess and Louise, who kept looking back, and left the scene together. On the other hand, the Queen of the West, who was still brooding over the empty grave of Sul Adrian, did not leave. Instead, she remained at the scene, although she had changed from standing on the ground to flying in the air with her huge bat wings spread wide. That way, she would be able to avoid many accidental injuries from the shockwaves of the battle. Su Shinxing had a general understanding of the other party's reluctance to leave. From the looks of the current situation, the figure in the black fog might really be the corpse of the missing Seve Adrian. If that was the case, Su Shinxing could somewhat understand the reason why he was on par with the other party in his current state. After all, the other party was the him of this world and the savior of this world. Even if the other party was a little weaker than him, it was probably not that much weaker. If that was the case with his current state, if he continued to fight with the other party with a half-assed mentality, he might really lose. That was why he had dismissed Louise and the church duo who were of no help. If it was possible, it would be best if the Queen of the West did not stay. But there was no time to continue persuading the stubborn vampire queen. He could only hope that she would fend for herself in the future. Su Shinxing dispersed the cloud scales on his body and stood expressionlessly where he was. Although the cloud scales could help him with many things, they were actually more of a limiter, limiting Su Shinxing's strength to a level where he could live normally in this world. When Su Shinxing got serious, the cloud scales, which were harder than any metal on Earth, became a burden instead. This did not change even when Su Shinxing was weakened by 1,000 times. First, the appetizer. Almost as soon as the word appetizer came out of his mouth, Su Xinqing had already appeared in front of the black fog without warning. The side of the sky island he was standing on collapsed directly when he stepped forward. From a little distance, the sky island, which originally looked like a saucer, was directly broken in 2/3. Then, Su Xinqing's fist easily penetrated the layer of black fog that could erode all matter in this world and pollute the minds of all living creatures, and imprinted the face of his fist on the other party's face. Unlike the previous attack, where almost all of the force was absorbed by the other party, the power this time was simply too strong. The space at the edge of the black fog seemed to have been pulled to its limit, and there was a strange stretching and wrinkling feeling. The person in the black fog was directly hit and flew out. The space behind him seemed to be torn apart by an invisible giant sword. Invisible black space-time cracks and void turbulence appeared everywhere. In the end, the aftermath of the power of the fist broke through the shattered space and blew away all the thick clouds over the floating island. For a time, the sky was restored to a cloudless and unusually clear state. But all this was not over. From the point of Su Xinqing's fist as the starting point, the world itself gradually began to show signs of collapse. Almost in a breath, the entire floating island was shrouded in the domain of collapse. Tisk, it's a bit too much. Even the initiator, Su Xinqing, could not help but feel a little embarrassed. This world itself had experienced a considerable disaster, and the stability of space was a little worse than that of Earth. With such a serious punch, the original balance was naturally broken. Wow, what is this? Even the Queen of the West, who had tried to stay away from the battlefield, was still shrouded in the collapse of the world in midair, and was a little flustered for a moment. Don't panic, I'll be right there. Su Xinqing hurriedly planned to do a standing long jump and jump over to save the other party from the collapse. However, at this moment, the person shrouded in the black fog appeared in front of him again. It was as if this punch, which could even collapse the world, did not even cause much damage to him. Su Xinqing could not help but feel a little anxious. Although he did not like the arrogant Queen of the West, she had at least entertained him and Louise in the castle, and he could not let her die in the turbulence of the collapse of the world. But for a moment, he could not figure out what the guy in the black fog was. Even the Demon King of Doom would be stunned for a long time after being hit by his punch. At this moment, Su Xinqing noticed that the broken crystal tablet, not far away, suddenly shattered into countless crystal fragments, and then the fragments released many light spots. The next moment, the world behind the Queen of the West, who was shrouded in starlight, cracked open. But the Queen herself did not die from the explosion of void energy, and was instead rescued by someone who carried her in a princess carry. It was a person who appeared from the crack behind her. He was wearing a black mage robe with a hood, and had slightly messy, spiky short hair. His facial features were identical to Su Xinqing's. It's been a long time since we last met, but you're still so unlucky, Sharon. The other party turned a blind eye to Su Xinqing's situation. Instead, he smiled and teased the vampire queen. Shi Wei, you're not dead. The latter looked as if she had seen a ghost, and her queenly demeanor disappeared without a trace. It'll take some time to explain, so let me deal with the current situation first. The man smiled and waved his hand, and the collapse of the world stopped abruptly. Then, as if a rewind button had been pressed, everything quickly returned to normal. Looking at the confused Su Xinqing, the man ignored the black fog and took the initiative to greet him. Nice to meet you. Although you probably know who I am, please allow me to introduce myself, he said. I am the guardian of this world, Shi Wei Adrian. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.